But Ganshan woke up to someone shaking his shoulder. A maid stood over him, her face contorted, repeating the same thing over and over. "Young master, get up! Young master, the ceremony is in 3 days." He blinked. The ceiling was wooden. The beams were rough and crooked. It smelled of dampness and something sour. He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't obey. His arms were thin. His chest was sunken. His knees stuck out like a teenager's after an illness. The last thing he remembered was the crack of the formwork and the foreman's scream. Then darkness. Then this ceiling. He looked at his palms. Not a single callus. Not a single scar from the rebar. Someone else's hands. Someone else's body. The maid kept chattering about the land distribution ceremony and how His Grace the Duke had ordered him to appear in clean clothes. Ganshan, or whoever now bore that name, nodded silently. She left. He sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there for about 10 minutes. Park Jun-ho, 29 years old, a graduate of KAIST, a civil engineer, the bridge across Asan Bay, the formwork collapsing. Death. And now this. He stood up. His legs were shaking. In the corner of the room stood a bronze mirror, dull and cloudy. He walked over and saw a stranger's face. Thin, pale, dark, deep-set eyes. He looked about 19. A thin chain with the No Family seal was visible around his neck. The fourth son of Duke No Taewan, the very one the servants called an empty vessel. No talent with a sword, not a drop of mana, not a single useful skill by this world's standards. Ganshan swallowed. His throat was parched. There was a jug of water on the table. He reached for it and noticed the scrolls. A map of the Huanyuan Empire, a list of provinces, the names of the brothers and their assignments. The first son, No Gonmin, received Chonghae, a rich land with a port and 3 cities. The second son was to receive Namwan, fertile plains and 2 trade routes. The third son was to receive Tonggrim, a forested province with hunting grounds and iron ore. The fourth son, No Gonchang, was to receive Hasogun. He unfolded the description. A semi-deserted territory on the southwestern border, 3,200 inhabitants. The soil is rock and clay. The river dries up in the summer. 1 dirt road, no wall, no garrison, no market. A debt to the treasury of 4,000 gold pieces with an annual income of 200. Nickname at court, Dusty Pit. Ganshan read it twice. Then he sat back down on the bed. In a past life, he had seen sights far worse. An industrial zone in Incheon, where the soil was so contaminated that they had to remove 2 meters of topsoil before laying the foundation. A marshy shore near Busan, where the piles sank into the mud and held nothing. That's where he learned the most important lesson. There's no such thing as a bad site. There's a lack of information about the soil. He looked at the map again. Limestone in the hills, clay in the soil, sulfur, a river with seasonal flow, 3,000 people out of work. His fingers traced the outline of the site. The engineering part of his brain was already at work. Limestone plus clay plus firing equals cement. A river with seasonal flow means we need a dam. Wind from the desert means energy. 3,000 pairs of hands mean a workforce. This isn't a dusty pit, it's a construction site. 3 days later, the ceremony took place. A huge hall in the Duke's ancestral estate. Columns of black stone. The family banners, but with a silver hawk. The 4 sons stood in a row before their father. Duke No Taewan sat on a dais. Massive, broad-shouldered. His gray beard was neatly trimmed. His eyes were cold and appraising. He looked at each of his sons. First, his gaze lingered with pride. On the second, with approval. On the third, with indifference. On the fourth, he did not linger at all. The ceremony was brief. Each son received a scroll with his appointment and the Lord's seal. When Gonchan accepted his seal, his elder brother Gonmin leaned toward him. He quietly offered his congratulations. Now, Gonchan was lord of 3,000 hungry mouths and a single dry well. Laughter rippled through the room. Gonchan said nothing. He clenched the seal in his fist and left the hall. The next morning, he departed. The wagon was old and creaky. There was only one horse, and it was skinny. Of his servants, only an old coachman named Mangil traveled with him. The journey to Hasogun took 5 days. For the first 2 days, the landscape was pleasant. Fields, villages, peasants on the roadside bowed when they saw the coat of arms on the wagon. On the 3rd day, the fields grew sparse. On the 4th day, they disappeared entirely. The earth turned gray. The grass withered. The trees became short and gnarled. The wind carried dust. Manjil remained silent the whole way, but on the 5th day, he couldn't hold back. He said that Hasogun began ahead, and that if the young master wanted to turn back, it would be better to do so now. Gonchan looked ahead. Brown hills were visible on the horizon. A thin line of road snaked between them. He said they would continue on. Manjil sighed and whipped the horse. Hasogun greeted him with dust. A steady, dry wind blew from the southwest. The village, if it could be called a village, consisted of several dozen mud brick houses. The roofs were thatched. Half of them had caved in. Skinny chickens and even skinnier children wandered between the houses. The road ended at a well. The well was lined with cracked stones and clearly yielded murky water. People had gathered around the well, about 30 of them. They stared at the wagon in silence. No greetings, no bows, only tired eyes and tight lips. Gonchan climbed down from the wagon. His legs were stiff from 5 days of jostling. He stood before them and introduced himself. He said he was the new Lord of Hasogun. Silence. Then an old man stepped out of the crowd, one arm, his left sleeve tucked into his belt, his face like the bark of an old tree. He called himself Han, a former soldier. He'd lived here for 40 years. He'd seen 3 lords come and go before this one. Han looked Gonchan in the eye and spoke plainly. Everyone here will die this winter. Not by enemies, by starvation. The new lord has 3 months. No one around him objected. They all knew this. Gonchan looked at the old man, then at the village, then at the hills beyond it. He said one word. Enough. Han blinked. Gonchan turned to Mangil and asked him to bring the bag of tools from the wagon. Then he bent down and scooped up a handful of earth. He rubbed it between his fingers. Clay, dense, high in kaolin. He sniffed it. No salts, suitable for firing. He raised his head and looked at the hills to the northeast. Light-colored rock on the slopes. Limestone. He looked at the riverbed. Dry now, but the marks on the banks spoke of a strong seasonal flow. He looked at the wind. Steady, from the southwest, at least 6 meters per second. In his mind, Park Jun-ho was already making plans. The well needs to be deepened and properly lined. A brick kiln should be placed at the foot of the eastern hill, where the clay is closest to the surface. Limestone should be quarried from the northern slope. The dam should be built at a narrow point in the riverbed, about 3 li to the west. He was so absorbed in his calculations that he didn't notice a girl approaching him. She was about 17, skinny like everyone here, but her back was straight and her gaze sharp. She asked what he was doing. Gonchan looked up. She introduced herself, Yoon So-hyun, the daughter of the late village headman. Gonchan asked if she could read and write. So-hyun lifted her chin. She said she was the only literate person in the whole village. Gonchan nodded. Then he said he needed someone who could count and keep records. He asked if she was willing to work. So-hyun sized him up with her eyes. For a long time. Then she said that the three previous lords had also promised her work. The first ran away after a month, the second after 2 weeks, the third didn't last 3 days. Ganchan replied that he promised nothing except that there would be plenty of work and little sleep. Sohyun snorted. She said they were used to that here. And so ended No Ganchan's first day in Hasogun. He stood in the middle of a dusty square with a handful of clay in his hand and a list of tasks in his head. Around him were 3,000 starving people, one dry well, and 3 months until winter. In his past life, Park Joon-ho had built bridges across bays. In this life, he had to build a civilization out of mud. The next morning, Ganchan woke up before dawn. The former village head's house, where he had been put up, was slightly sturdier than the rest. The walls were made of mud bricks, but at least they had a stone foundation. The roof didn't leak. The floor was earthen and packed down. He sat down on a mat and took out of his bag the only valuable item he had taken from his father's estate, a set of drafting tools, a ruler, a set square, a few graphite stubs, a stack of rice paper. He spread the paper on the floor and began to draw. The first sketch was simple, a well. The existing well in the village was 4 meters deep, lined with rough-hewn stone. The joints were open. Groundwater seeped through the walls and carried mud with it. People drank the murky water and fell ill. The solution was simple. Dig it down to 8 meters. Line it with fired bricks using a mortar of lime and sand. Build a clay ring around the top so rainwater wouldn't run inside. Put a lid on it. He finished drawing and moved on to the second sheet, a brick kiln. The simplest design. A rectangular pit 2 by 3 meters. The walls were lined with unfired bricks, a stone grate at the bottom for the firebox, loaded from the top, firing temperature around 900 degrees. Firewood is scarce here, but on the hillsides he saw dry brush, and there was peat here too. He noticed dark patches near a bend in the river, a classic sign of a peat bog. Peat burns for a long time and provides enough heat for firing. Third sketch, a lime pit. The limestone from the northern slope had to be broken into pieces and fired at a high temperature. This produces quicklime. Add water and you get slaked lime. Mix it with sand and there you have mortar. Mix it with volcanic ash, or in this case, with the fine pumice he'd seen in the Western Ravine, and you get Roman concrete, a material that isn't afraid of water and lasts for centuries. In this world, they built with clay mortar. It washed away every spring. Houses crumbled, walls cracked, bridges collapsed. Concrete will change everything. When the sun rose, Ganchan stepped out into the square. Sohyun was already waiting for him. Hong stood nearby, and about 20 other people. Curious onlookers, or perhaps those who had nothing left but curiosity. Ganchan crouched down and smoothed the ground with a stick. He began to draw. Here is a well. This is how it works now. Dirty water seeps through the walls. People get sick. This is how it will be. Deeper. Bricks. A clay lock. Clean water. He looked at their faces. Empty. Confused. They didn't know what a brick was. To them, a stone was just a stone. Ganchan stood up. He asked Sohyun to gather all the men capable of working. Not tomorrow, today. Sohyun frowned and asked how many he needed. He replied that he needed all of them. An hour later, about 120 people stood before him. Skinny, ragged. Someone was coughing. 2 had festering wounds on their hands. Ganchan divided them into 3 groups. The first group of 40 men is going to the eastern hill to dig for clay. He pointed out exactly where on the map. The clay must be reddish and dense, not gray and crumbly, but specifically red. The second group of 30 men is going to the northern slope To break up limestone, we need pieces the size of a fist, no bigger. The third group of 50 people stays in the village, there to dig a pit for a kiln. He measured the dimensions with his strides right on the ground. The people exchanged glances. A middle-aged man stepped forward and asked why all this was necessary. Gonchan answered simply, "Winter is 3 months away. If they do nothing, everyone will die of starvation. If they do what he says, they'll have sturdy houses, clean water, and a food supply." The man asked how the new lord knew all this. Gonchan said he'd read it in a book, a very old one. It had burned. The man looked at him as if he were mad, but he went to dig. The rest followed him, not because they believed him, but because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. The first 3 days were hell. Gonchan worked alongside everyone else. His body was weak and unaccustomed to physical labor. By the end of the first day, his palms were raw and bleeding. By the end of the second, he could barely straighten his back. By the end of the third, he was sick with exhaustion. But he didn't stop. People noticed. The Lord who kneads clay with his bare hands. The Lord who hauls stones and falls but gets back up. A Lord who didn't leave. It didn't mean anything yet, but they noticed. By the fourth day, the pit for the kiln was ready. Gonchan lined the walls with adobe bricks. He showed them how to shape it from wet clay and dry it in the sun. The simplest form, a wooden frame. Fill it with clay, tamp it down, remove the frame, dry for 2 days. In a week, they made 400 adobe bricks, enough for the kiln walls and the grate. He conducted the first firing himself. He loaded the adobe bricks into the kiln. He built a fire from peat and dry brush. He covered it with clay slabs to retain the heat. The fire burned all night. Gonchan didn't sleep. He sat by the kiln and monitored the temperature. He judged the heat by the color of the flame. Orange was too low. Yellow was just right. White was too high. He kept it at yellow for 8 hours. In the morning, when the kiln had cooled, he pulled out the first brick. Red, resonant. When struck against each other, the 2 bricks rang like bells. Gonchan smiled for the first time since coming into this world. So-hyun stood nearby and looked at the brick in his hands. She asked what it was. He replied that it was Hasogun's future. She raised an eyebrow, skeptically, but she wrote it down in the log. Fired brick, first batch, 400 pieces, good quality. At the same time, he launched lime production. Limestone from the northern slope was crushed and loaded into a separate pit. It was fired for a day. The resulting white lumps were doused with water. The reaction was violent. Hissing, steam, heat. One worker burned his hand because he stuck it too close. After that, Gonchan established the first safety rule. Do not approach the lime without gloves. The gloves were sewn from rags in 2 layers. Primitive, but it worked. Slaked lime mixed with sand produced a mortar. Strong, quick setting. Gonchan smeared it on the wall of the village headman's house as a test. 2 days later, the mortar had set solidly. The wall, which had previously crumbled at the slightest touch, could now withstand a punch. Han came to take a look. He felt the wall. He tapped it. He shook his head and walked away without saying a word. By the end of the second week, Gonchan began work on the well. The old well was dismantled. They deepened the pit to 8 meters. 5 men worked in shifts. The walls were lined with fired bricks set in lime mortar. Around the top, they built a clay ring a fist thick. They placed a stone cover with a hole in it. When the work was finished, Gonchan lowered a bucket. He pulled it up. The water was clear. People stood around watching. Someone scooped up a mugful and tasted it. An expression crossed his face that Gonchan didn't immediately understand. Then he understood. Surprise. They had never drunk clean water here. They didn't know water could be like this. That evening, Gonchan sat in his house and made a list. We have clean water. There are bricks. There is mortar. The next step is the road. The dirt road to Khashogun was the only link to the outside world. When it rained, it turned into a swamp. Merchants gave it a wide berth. Without a road, there is no trade. No trade, no money. No money, no food for the winter. He sketched out a plan. Drainage ditches on both sides, a base of compacted gravel, a surface of a mixture of clay and lime. The Romans called this opus caementicium. No one here knew that. So-hyun entered without knocking. She placed a scroll before him. The census. 3,187 residents. Of those, 412 able-bodied men, 530 women capable of work, 240 children over 10 years old who can help. The rest are sick and elderly. 6 weeks' worth of grain. Almost no livestock. 12 goats, 3 oxen, chickens. Gonshin looked at the numbers. 6 weeks' worth of grain, but 12 weeks until winter. A 6-week shortfall. They need to either find food, earn money for it, or grow it. He asked So-hyun when they usually sow here. She replied that it's in the spring. It's summer now. The sowing season has passed. Gonshin thought it over. In this climate, with enough water, they could grow fast-maturing crops. Turnips, peas, radishes. 30 to 40 days until harvest. If they planted now, and if the dam provided water, there would be at least something by fall. He told So-hyun that tomorrow they were going to the river. She asked why. He replied that they were going to build a dam. She looked at him the way one looks at a man who suggests catching the moon with a net. But she made a note of it. The river was called Hansu, a thin, murky ribbon of water in a wide, dry bed. In summer, it turned into a stream. In spring, it overflowed and flooded the lowlands. All the water came and went to no avail. Gonchan stood on the bank and watched. The engineer's eyes saw not a river, but a problem. The riverbed was 30 meters wide at this point, but 3 kilometers to the west, it narrowed to 12. Rocky outcrops on both banks, the perfect spot for a dam. He went there and spent half a day taking measurements. A stick with notches instead of a tape measure. A stone on a string instead of a plumb line. The depth of the riverbed at the narrowest point was 4 meters. The rock on the banks was hard limestone. The bottom was sandy with a clay subsoil. He sat down on a rock and began to calculate. The dam would be 5 meters high. The base would be 8 meters wide. The crest would be 3 meters wide. The length would be 12 meters. The materials are stone and clay with lime mortar. The volume of masonry is approximately 700 cubic meters. With 100 workers and manual labor, that's 2 months. He had 10 weeks until winter. Tight, but possible. He returned to the village and announced the construction. The reaction was predictable. No one knew what a dam was. He explained. A stone wall across the river. Water accumulates. A lake is formed. The canals lead from the lake to the fields. The fields are irrigated. Food grows. The explanation was simple, but people looked at him with suspicion. One old man said that the gods give water when they want to, and take it away when they want. Building a wall across the river is like arguing with the heavens. Gonchan replied that he wasn't arguing with the heavens. He was simply asking the water to wait. The joke fell flat. But the next morning, 120 people went out to the river. So-hyun organized the logistics. She turned out to be a natural-born manager. She divided the people into teams. She appointed foremen. She kept track of working hours. Every evening, she brought Gonchan a report. How many stones had been quarried? How much mortar had been mixed? How many rows had been laid? Gonchan taught the masons from scratch. He showed them how to place stones in the mortar, how to level the rows, how to tie the joints so the wall wouldn't collapse. Patiently, 10 times over. They made mistakes. The walls came out crooked. The mortar was sometimes too runny, sometimes too thick. Ganshan would redo it and show them again. In his past life, Park Joon-ho had managed construction crews. He knew that people learn not from explanations, but from repetition. Within a week, the masons could already lay a straight row without his supervision. After 2 weeks, they began to do it quickly. The dam grew, row by row, stone by stone. The work was hard. People carried stones on their backs. They mixed the mortar with their feet in pits. Their hands were covered in scrapes and calluses. But no one complained, not because they were heroes, but because the alternative was simple. Don't build the dam and die in the winter, or build it and maybe survive. In the 3rd week, the first emergency occurred. The wall at the bottom cracked. Water was seeping through the joints. Ganshan inspected the damage and realized his mistake. The foundation had been laid on sand without compaction. The sand had been washed away, and the stones had settled. In a past life, this was called a mistake in foundation preparation, a standard situation. He ordered the bottom 3 rows to be dismantled, dig out the sand down to the clay subgrade, tamp down the clay, lay a layer of large stones, and only then start building, laying the foundation anew. 3 days of work were lost. The men grumbled. One foreman said outright that the new lord didn't know what he was doing. Ganshan didn't argue. He picked up a shovel and began digging himself, in silence. An hour later, the foreman joined him, silently too. By the end of the 4th week, the dam had reached half its height. And then the rains came. Not the rainy season, just a storm front. 2 days of downpours. The river rose. Water poured into the unfinished dam. Ganshan stood knee-deep in water and gave orders. Bags of clay to the crest, stones into the gaps. Faster! Everyone worked. Men, women, children over 10. Even Han, with one hand, hauled sacks by clamping the rope between his teeth. By the morning of the 3rd day, the rain had stopped. The dam held. The lower section, which they had rebuilt after the crack, held perfectly. The upper section got wet but didn't crumble. Ganshan sat on a wet rock and caught his breath. His hands were shaking from exhaustion. Sohyun walked over and sat down beside him. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she'd noticed something. All 3 previous lords had fled before the first rain. Ganshan replied that rain was just water. She smiled wryly and said she'd tell that to the people who'd stood in the river for 2 days because he'd asked them to. After the rain, the work went faster. Something had changed. The people were no longer just following orders. They began to understand. They saw how the water was pooling behind the unfinished dam. They saw that the level was rising. They saw that the wall was holding. An elderly peasant named Bo Mu approached Ganshan and said he understood why the dam was needed. The water stays put instead of running away. Then it can be released onto the fields. That's what you do with a barrel. Only this barrel is big. Ganshan nodded. Exactly. A big barrel. By the end of the 6th week, the dam was finished. 5 meters high, 12 meters long. Stone masonry set with lime mortar. A spillway at the top for floods. A gate made of oak logs to regulate the flow. The water began to accumulate. A small lake was forming behind the dam. Ganshan stood on the crest and watched. In a past life, he had built bridges across estuaries. This dam was 1,000 times simpler than any of them. But looking at it, he felt something he had never felt before. It was the first structure in this world that could save lives. Not abstractly, like a bridge that cars drive across, but literally. Without this water, 3,000 people would die in the winter. With it, they would survive. The next step was the canals. Ganshan marked out the route from the lake to the fields, a slope of 2 centimeters per meter. The canal's width was half a meter. The depth was 40 centimeters. The walls were coated with clay so the water wouldn't seep into the ground. 3 main canals fanned out from the lake. Each served its own section of fields. Everyone dug. The work was easier than building the dam. By this point, people already knew how to dig in an organized manner. The teams worked in unison. So-hyun kept an eye on the schedule. 10 days later, the canals were ready. Gonchan opened the gate. The water flowed. Slowly, down the stone trough, then through the canal, to the first field. The peasants stood and watched as the water spread across the dry, cracked earth. Silence. Then a woman in the crowd began to cry. Gonchan didn't wait. He was already handing out seeds, turnips, peas, radishes, fast-growing crops, 30 to 40 days until harvest. He explained how to plant them, in rows, with spacing, not all together as they were used to, but each crop in its own plot. The peasants didn't understand why. They'd always planted everything mixed together. That's how their grandfathers did it. Gonchan explained, different plants take different nutrients from the soil. If planted together, they compete. If planted separately, each gets more. And another thing, peas return to the soil what the turnips take. That's why the following year, these plots need to be swamped. This is called crop rotation. The peasants listened. They didn't believe him, but they planted as he said. Because the water in the canals was real, and the bricks were real, and the well provided clean water. Maybe this strange lord isn't lying about the seeds either. In the evening, Gonchan sat on the roof of the village headman's house and looked out at the fields. In the moonlight, he could see the water glistening in the canals, small rectangles of planted plots. He counted in his head. If the seedlings came up normally, and if there were no frost before the season, then in 40 days there would be the first harvest. That wouldn't be enough for the winter, but it would cover the shortfall. 6 weeks of grain from the reserves, plus the harvest of fast-growing crops, plus the little that could be gathered from wild plants in the hills. Just enough. But just enough isn't zero. He lay on his back and looked at the stars. The sky here was incredible. Not a single speck of light pollution. The Milky Way like a river stretching from horizon to horizon. He had never seen so many stars in Seoul. Park Joon-ho thought that if he were to die, at least the sky here was beautiful. But Gonchan thought it was too early to die. The turnips sprouted on the 9th day. Green shoots broke through the damp earth in neat rows. The peasants came to look at them as if they were a miracle. For them, it was a miracle. Hasogun's land had never yielded 2 harvests a year. It barely yielded 1 at all. And here, the summer sowing had sprouted in 9 days. The peas sprouted on the 12th day, the radishes on the 7th. The fields turned green. Water from the canals nourished the roots. Gonchan walked around the crops every morning and checked their condition. He counted the sprouts. He looked at the color of the leaves. He felt the soil. These were the skills of an agronomist, not an engineer. But at KAIST, he had taken a course in soil science and remembered the basic principles. Nitrogen for the leaves, phosphorus for the roots, potassium for the fruits. Peas fix nitrogen from the air through bacteria in their roots. That's why he planted the peas next to the turnips, to enrich the soil. While the fields were turning green, Gonchan turned his attention to the road. The dirt road from Hasogun to the nearest town, Volsan, was in terrible condition. Potholes, holes, sections where the clay had been washed away into impassable mud. Carts got stuck, merchants took detours. A 2-day journey could be cut to 1 if the road were repaired. He started with the nearest section, about 10 miles from the village, the most damaged stretch. The method was simple. Dig drainage ditches on both sides, fill the base with crushed limestone gravel, tamp it down, a layer of clay and lime mixture on top, tamp it down again. Roman roads lasted for thousands of years. This one won't last 1,000, but it will definitely survive the rainy season. He sent 60 men to work on the road. The rest continued working at the brick kiln and the lime pit. Production of building materials couldn't stop. He needed thousands of bricks, dozens of barrels of mortar. Gonchan also started composting. He gathered all the village's organic waste, food scraps, straw, manure from goats and oxen. He piled it into a pit, alternating layers: green waste, dry waste, manure, soil. He watered it down. He explained that in 2 months it would turn into fertilizer that would make the soil more fertile. The peasants looked at the pit of rotting waste with disgust. One said that the Lord was forcing them to pile up trash instead of throwing it away. Gonchan replied that in 2 months, this pile of trash would be more useful than all of Hasogun's manure in a year. They didn't believe him, but they left the pit alone. At the same time, Gonchan began boiling water. Every evening, he gathered the people and explained, "Water must be boiled before drinking. Tiny creatures live in the water that cause disease. Boiling kills them." The reaction was predictable. "What creatures? The water is clear. Nothing lives in it. Our grandfathers drank unboiled water and lived." Gonchan didn't argue. He asked So-hyun to keep track of the sick. 8 people fell ill during the first week. All of them had drunk untreated water. Not a single person among those who had boiled their water fell ill. After a month, the statistics were convincing. Stomach ailments had decreased by 2/3. People began to boil their water. Not because they believed in tiny creatures, but because the numbers were obvious. At the end of the second month, a traveler arrived in Hasogun. Big, dirty, reeking of booze. He stumbled into the village toward evening and asked where the blacksmith shop was. They pointed him to a ramshackle building on the outskirts. It was Pek Talsu's blacksmith shop, or rather, what was left of it. Gonchan had long wanted to talk to the local blacksmith, but the man avoided everyone. He drank, he slept. Sometimes he hammered at bronze with no visible result. The villagers said he was useless. He could only work with bronze, and nobody needed bronze. There was no iron in Hasogun, and they had no money to buy any. Gonchan went to the smithy. Talsu sat by an extinguished furnace and staring into space. Bronze blanks lay scattered nearby, shapeless, crooked. He raised his cloudy eyes to Gonchan and asked what the Lord wanted from a drunken failure. Gonchan sat down beside him. He examined the furnace, a smelting furnace, primitive, maximum temperature of 1200 degrees. Enough for bronze, not for iron, and certainly not for steel. He asked Thalsu if he knew what iron was. Thalsu snorted. Of course he knew. Iron was brought in from Volsona. Expensive, heavy, it rusts, but stronger than bronze. They make swords for warriors and plows for rich landowners out of it. Gonchan asked if Thalsu wanted to make something better than iron. Thalsu stared at him. Better than iron. He didn't understand the question. Nothing is better than iron. Except maybe magical weapons from the Tower of the Wise. But that's magic, not blacksmithing. Gonchan pulled a scroll from his bosom, a blueprint. He had worked on it for 3 nights. A blast furnace. A vertical structure, 4 meters high, an inner diameter of about a meter. Walls made of fire brick. Hand-operated bellows for supplying air. Loaded from the top. Alternating layers of ore, coal, and flux. The temperature inside reaches 1,500 degrees. At that temperature, iron melts. Completely. It doesn't sinter into slag like in a raw iron furnace. It actually melts. The liquid metal flows downward. The slag rises to the top. The result is cast iron. And from cast iron, through a second firing with air blowing through it, steel is produced. Thalsu looked at the drawing. For a long time. His hands stopped shaking. His eyes became clear for the first time in years. He ran his finger along the lines of the furnace. He asked where the Lord had gotten this drawing. Gonchan said he'd read it in a book, an old one. It had burned. Thalsu looked at him, then back at the drawing, then back at him, and said that if it was true, he needed ore. Gonchan smiled. He knew there were deposits of brown iron ore in the hills to the east, low iron content, about 30%, but enough for a blast furnace. He'd seen the characteristic reddish-brown outcrops on the slopes. He also needed coal, wood coal. Peat wasn't suitable for smelting. Gonchan had already spotted a grove about 10 miles to the north. The trees were dry and old. They'd have to be felled and burned in charcoal pits. And flux, limestone, which was in abundance here. He told Thals that the ore would be ready in a week, coal in 2. The flux was already there. Thals, could he build the furnace according to the blueprint? Thals stood up, straightened himself. He turned out to be tall, broad shoulders, huge hands, the hands of a blacksmith who had been hammering bronze for 20 years and lived with the feeling that he was wasting his life. He said he would build it. Gonchan nodded and left. So-hyun was waiting for him outside. She had seen the blueprint when Gonchan was drawing it and added it to her list. Book number 48. It burned. She said the list was getting long. Gonchan shrugged. Meanwhile, the harvest was approaching. On the 35th day after sowing, the turnips were ready to be harvested. Large, juicy. The peasants dug them up and couldn't believe it. That size, from this soil. It's impossible. But the turnips lay in the baskets and were completely real. The peas ripened on the 40th day. The pods were full. The seeds were uniform. The radishes grew even faster than Gonchan had expected. The soil turned out to be better than it looked. The kaolin clay retained moisture and, with proper irrigation from the canals, provided a good environment for root crops. The harvest wasn't huge, but it was enough to cover the 6-week shortfall. Gonchan ordered everything to be gathered and divided into 3 parts. 1/3 for food now, 1/3 in storage for the winter, 1/3 for seeds for the next planting. The peasants didn't understand why they should save seeds. They were used to eating everything right away and hoping for the next year. Gonchan explained, if they ate the seeds now, there would be nothing to plant in the spring, and next fall, there would be famine again. If they saved them, each crop would yield more than the last. They listened. For the first time, they listened attentively, not as a lord's command, but as the words of a man who had never once lied. The water in the well was clear. The dam stood firm. The canals were working. The turnips had grown. Maybe he was right about the seeds, too. That evening, Hong came to Gonchan's house. He stood at the door. Then he went inside. He said that in the spring, he had said everyone here would die in the winter. Gonchan replied that he remembered. Hong was silent for a moment. Then he said he had come to apologize. Maybe not everyone would die. Gonchan invited him to sit down and eat some porridge. Hong sat down. They ate in silence. It was the first meal Gonchan had shared not as a lord with a subject, but as one human being with another. Autumn was at the doorstep. Winter lay ahead, the hardest time of all. But Hasogun now had water in the well and in the canals. There were bricks and mortar. There was a repaired road. There was grain in the granary. And there was a blacksmith who, for the first time in years, wasn't drinking, but was building a furnace that would change everything. Winter struck at the beginning of the 11th month. The wind from the desert turned icy. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night. The mud brick houses froze through and through. People huddled around the hearths and burned anything that would burn. Gonchan knew that winter would be harsh. He prepared. 2 weeks before the first frost, he organized the insulation of the houses. The walls were coated with a double layer of clay mortar mixed with straw. The cracks in the roofs were filled with a mixture of clay and horsehair. The doors were hung with heavy hides. 10 houses were in such poor condition that it made no sense to repair them. Gonchan ordered them to be torn down, and the residents moved into new houses. The new houses were simple but sturdy. Brick walls set in lime mortar. Roofs of logs and straw, small windows covered with oiled cloth, a stove in the corner with a chimney leading outside. Each house was built in 5 days by a crew of 10 men. They managed to build 8 houses before the snow fell, not 10. The remaining 2 had to be patched up in a hurry. Gonchan blamed himself. He should have started earlier. Food supplies were counted every day. So-hyun kept track down to the last handful of grain: turnips, peas, dried radishes, wild onions from the hills, salted fish they managed to trade for 4 barrels of lime from a passing caravan. The caravan driver laughed at first. Lime? Who needs lime in the desert? Then Gonchan showed him how the mortar bonds the stones. The caravan driver stopped laughing and gave them the fish, and he promised to return in the spring. Every evening, Gonchan sat down with So-hyun and did the math. Daily rations, consumption, remaining supply, number of mouths to feed. He instituted rationing. Every adult received 2 bowls of porridge a day, children 3. Pregnant and nursing women got 4, no exceptions. He himself ate 2 bowls. People saw this. The Lord eats as much as they do, no more. That meant more than all his words. By the 3rd week of winter, food had become critically scarce. Gonchan hadn't slept for 3 days. He calculated, recalculated, he checked, he looked for reserves. There were none. He sat over the scrolls and the numbers blurred before his eyes. On the 4th day, So-hyun entered the room. Without knocking, as always, she placed a bowl of porridge in front of him, hot. Gonchan looked at her. So-hyun didn't leave. She stood there, watching until he picked up a spoon. He ate. The porridge was watery. There were fewer grains in it than water, but it was hot. So-hyun sat down across from him. She said that all 3 previous lords had fled before winter. He was the first to stay behind to count. Gonchan didn't answer. He finished his porridge and went back to the numbers. In the morning, he found a solution. Not perfect, but it worked. There were fish in the lake behind the dam. Not many, small ones, but they were there. The Hansu River carried fry from its headwaters, and they remained in the pond. In 2 months, they had grown. Gonchan sent out fishermen. There were no fishermen in Hasogun. There were peasants to whom he explained how to weave a simple net from plant fibers. It took 3 days to weave. The first cast brought in 24 fish, small ones, but it was protein. The second cast yielded more. By the end of the week, fishing provided an extra ration to go with the porridge. Gonchan also remembered the soybeans. Wild soybeans grew in the lowlands by the river. He had seen them in the summer, but hadn't paid them any mind. Now the pods had dried out and stood on their stems. The seeds inside were small, but edible. He sent the women and children out to gather them. In a week, they collected nearly a sackful. Not much, but every handful counted. Winter dragged on. The days were all the same. Gray skies, an icy wind, the smell of smoke from the stoves, the crunch of frozen ground underfoot. Gonchan used the winter months for tasks that didn't require working outdoors. Teaching. Every evening, he gathered people in the largest house, the very one that had been plastered with lime mortar. He spoke. He explained. He drew with a stick on the earthen floor. Topic 1. Crop rotation. Why you can't plant the same thing in the same field every year. Why you need to alternate grains and legumes. Why 1 field out of 3 needs to rest. The farmers listened skeptically. Their grandfathers had planted wheat in the same field for 30 years straight. Gonchan explained that this was precisely why the harvests were getting smaller every year. The soil was being depleted. It needed time. And legumes. The peas they had planted in the summer had already begun to restore the fields. In the spring, they would see the difference. Topic 2. Hygiene. Wash your hands, boil water, don't relieve yourself near the well. Take waste outside the village. This topic met with the most resistance. Wash your hands. Why? They're already clean. Gonchan didn't bother explaining about bacteria. Instead, he cited statistics. So-hyun kept records from day one. In homes where people washed their hands in boiled water, they got sick half as often. The numbers were more convincing than words. Topic 3. Basics of construction. How to lay bricks. How to mix mortar. How to maintain a right angle. How to measure distance in steps. Gonchan was training future builders. A major construction project was coming up in the spring, and he would need people who could at least keep a wall from collapsing on the third day. Among the listeners, a young man named So Dao stood out. 20 years old, quiet. But he remembered everything the first time. A week later, he was explaining to the others how to mix mortar. 2 weeks later, he was drawing building plans on the floor, a bit crooked, but correct. Gonchan appointed him senior apprentice. Meanwhile, Thalsu was building a blast furnace in the smithy, all by himself, every day. He erected a stone frame and lined it with fire bricks. Gonchan fired the fire bricks himself at a higher temperature, adding sand to the clay for heat resistance. Thalsu made the bellows from goat skins and wooden frames, 2 bellows, pumping them with his hands one after the other. The air supply was continuous. The furnace grew, meter by meter. Thalsu didn't drink. He barely ate. He worked from dawn till dusk. His eyes burned with a fire that had nothing to do with alcohol. It was the fire of a master who had waited 20 years for a real challenge. By midwinter, the furnace was almost ready. There wasn't enough ore. Mining in the hills was impossible in winter. The ground was frozen solid. There weren't enough tools. Thalsu paced around the furnace like a hungry dog circling a bowl. He waited for spring. The hound waited with him. He knew that the first smelting would change everything. Steel isn't just a metal. Steel is plows that cut twice as deep into the earth, axes that chop twice as fast, saws, hammers, nails. Every steel tool increases productivity tenfold. And steel is also a weapon, but it's too early to think about that. Winter was past its midpoint, the darkest days, the coldest nights. 2 old men died, one from the cold, the other from lung disease. Gonchan attended the funerals. He didn't know their names when they were alive. So-hyun knew. She named them. Park Yeon-soo, 73 years old, a former farmer. Kim Bon-hee, 68 years old, a widow. Gonchan remembered. The next day, he ordered a warm room to be set up for the elderly and the sick. An entire house was set aside for this purpose. The stove was stoked around the clock. There was always hot water to drink. Guards kept watch over the fire. No more elderly people died that winter. Spring arrived at the beginning of the second month. Slowly. First, the wind grew warmer. Then the snow began to melt. The ground softened. Green shoots emerged from beneath the brown grass. The river swelled with meltwater. The dam filled to the brim. The spillway was working. The excess water flowed out through the chute and did not flood the village. Gonchan stood on the crest of the dam and looked out at the lake, full, glistening in the spring sun. Behind him lay the village that had survived the winter. 3,123 people. They'd lost 2. They could have lost hundreds. He turned to Sokyeon, who was standing nearby with a journal in her hands. He asked how much grain was left. She looked at her notes. 12 sacks, enough for a week. But in 3 weeks, the first spring planting would begin, and in 2 months, the first real harvest. They exchanged glances. Both smiled. Hasegun had survived its first winter. Now, the real work began. Spring arrived quickly. The snow melted in 10 days. The ground dried out. Gonchan didn't waste a single day. On the morning of the first dry day, he led everyone able to work out into the fields. The spring sowing was nothing like that emergency summer sowing. Now Gonchan had a plan. 3 fields. The first was sown with wheat. The second with peas and beans. The third was left fallow. Goats and oxen were driven onto the fallow field. Their manure would serve as fertilizer. A year later, the fields would switch places. A classic 3-field crop rotation that had been practiced for 2,000 years in his former world. Here, they didn't know it. Here, they planted the same crop on the same field until the soil turned to dust. Then they abandoned the field and cleared a new one. If there was anything to clear. In Hasogun, there was nothing to clear. That's why the harvest fell every year. That's why there was famine. That's why there was death. Gonchan marked out the plots with stakes. He explained the planting scheme to the foremen. He showed them the depth of the furrows, the distance between rows, the seeding rate. The peasants worked with confidence. Over the winter, they had grown accustomed to listening to his explanations, and, most importantly, they saw the results. The summer turnips had grown. The winter peas had produced pods. The canals were working. The well provided clean water. This strange lord who read burnt books had not made a single mistake so far. Alongside the sowing, Gonchan launched ore mining. Thalsu had been waiting for this moment all winter. He personally led a brigade of 20 men to the eastern hills. Brown iron ore came to the surface in layers, loose, rust-colored. They chipped away at it with pickaxes and loaded it into baskets. In a week, they hauled in 200 poods. Not much, but enough for the first smelting. They burned the ore in pits north of the village. They felled dry trees, chopped them into logs, stacked them in a cone in the pit, covered them with turf, set them alight from below. The smoke billowed for 3 days. On the 4th day, they opened the pit. Black chunks of coal, light and crisp. Falsu picked up a piece and sniffed it. He smiled. Good coal. Hot. The first smelting took place in the middle of the 3rd month. Gonchan came to the furnace at dawn. Falsu was already there. He hadn't slept all night. He checked the masonry, cleaned the nozzle, adjusted the bellows. The loading was done in layers. Coal, ore, limestone as flux, coal again, ore again. They filled the furnace to the brim. Falsu lit the fire. 2 assistants began pumping the bellows, one after the other. Left, right, left, right. Air flowed continuously. The flames roared. The temperature rose. 1 hour, 2, 3. The furnace hummed. The stones glowed red hot, then white hot. The heat was so intense that it was impossible to stand closer than 3 steps away. Thalsu stood 2 steps away. His face glistened with sweat. His eyes never left the outlet at the bottom of the furnace. At 5 o'clock, something began to flow from the opening. First, slag, gray, lightweight, glassy. Thalsu guided it aside with a clay trough. Then, from beneath the slag, metal appeared. White, blinding, liquid. It flowed slowly like honey. It dripped into a stone mold lined with wet sand. Thalsu stood and watched. His hands hung at his sides. His lips trembled. Tears streamed down his cheeks. He was crying. This huge man, who had been hammering bronze for 20 years and considered himself useless, stood by the furnace and wept as he watched the first smelting of his life. Gonchan stood behind him and said nothing. He knew what this moment meant. Not for Hasogun, for Thalsu personally. 20 wasted years had just found meaning. The cast iron cooled for 2 hours. Then Thalsu pulled it out of the mold. Gray, heavy, fragile. It wasn't steel yet. Cast iron. Too much carbon. Gonchan explained the next step. Refiring in an open furnace with air blowing through it. Oxygen burns off the excess carbon. Cast iron becomes steel. Thalsu listened intently. He nodded. He memorized it. The next day, he loaded the cast iron pieces into the furnace. He pumped the bellows. He began the blowing. Ganshan watched. Temperature, time, the color of the metal. When the cast iron turned cherry red, Thalsu snatched it out with tongs and began to forge it. The hammer crashed down on the red-hot ingot. Sparks flew in all directions. A blow, another blow, another. Thalsu hammered like a man possessed. He turned it over, folded it, hammered it again. The metal changed under his hands. It became denser, brighter, ringier. An hour later, a strip of steel lay on the anvil. Thalsu picked it up. He tried to bend it. The strip sprang back and returned to its original position. He ran his finger along the edge. He raised his head and looked at Ganshan. He said one word. Steel. Ganshan nodded. Steel. The news spread through the village within an hour. The blacksmith had forged iron from stones from the hills. People came to the smithy and stood watching. Thalsu paid them no mind. He was already making plans. The first items should not be weapons. Ganshan had made that clear in advance. The first items would be tools. A steel plow, a steel axe, a steel saw, steel nails. Each such tool replaced 3 iron ones and 10 bronze ones. A steel plow cut deeper into the earth. It turned over a thicker layer of soil. The furrow was smoother. A single peasant with a steel plow could plow as much in a day as 3 with wooden ones. Thalsu forged plows first, 10 of them in 2 weeks. Ganshan distributed them among the teams. Plowing for the second crop went 3 times faster. The farmers stroked the steel blades and shook their heads in amazement. One elderly farmer said that in the province of Changha, only the Lord's personal farmers had such plows. But here in Dusty Pit, every work crew had one. Next came the axes. A steel axe felled a tree in 20 minutes that would have taken half a day to chop with a bronze one. Timber harvesting sped up exponentially. Logs for construction, firewood for the winter, coal for the furnace. All of this required wood, and steel axes made wood accessible. Then saws, then nails, then shovels with steel blades. Each new tool opened up new possibilities. With nails and saws, it was possible to build wooden frames. With shovels, digging was faster. With axes, they could chop wood. Hasogun began to change before our eyes. Ganshan used the spring for large-scale construction. He divided the work into 3 areas. First, housing. New brick houses for all residents. Not 10, not 20, for everyone. A standard design. 4 walls of fired brick, a stone foundation, a roof of logs and tiles. Yes, tiles. Ganshan launched the production of clay tiles in the same kiln that fired the bricks. The shapes were simple, flat tiles with a curved edge. Firing made them waterproof. A house with a tiled roof didn't leak, didn't rot, didn't catch fire from an accidental spark. Dal oversaw the construction. Over the winter, he'd mastered the basics and now commanded a crew of 30 men. They built 2 houses a week. Brick walls rose row by row, straight, neat. Dal turned out to be a perfectionist. He checked every joint. He repositioned bricks that had been laid crookedly. His crew grumbled, but the walls stood flawlessly. The second project? The bridge. The Hansu River divided the Hasogun territory in half. People lived on the south bank. The north bank held pastures and forest. They crossed by wading. In spring and fall, when the water rose, crossing was impossible. The livestock on the north bank was left unattended. People drowned. Not often, but 1 person every year. Ganshan was building an arch bridge, a single span, a stone arch. The river was 18 meters wide at the chosen spot. The arch was 6 meters high enough for water to pass under the bridge even during high water. He built the arch on wooden formwork. It was the only structure in his life where he could apply his professional skills directly. Formwork for an arch was what he had been taught at university. load calculations, the thickness of the arch, the size of the wedge-shaped stones, the keystone at the top. He explained every step to the masons. The stones for the arch had to be cut into wedges, the wide part facing outward, the narrow part facing inward. When the arch closes, each stone will press against the one next to it, and the entire structure will become stronger under load. This is counterintuitive. Weight makes the arch stronger. The masons didn't believe it. How could weight make something stronger? Gonchan demonstrated with his fingers. He folded his hands into a house shape. He pressed down from above. His hands didn't spread apart. On the contrary, they squeezed tighter. An arch works the same way. Building the bridge took 6 weeks. When the formwork was removed, everyone froze. They expected it to collapse. The arch stood firm. Gonchan was the first to walk across it, alone. Then he stood in the middle and jumped. The stone didn't budge. The rest followed him, carefully, then more boldly. Then they drove an ox with a loaded cart across. The bridge held. Third direction, the road. The section they repaired in the fall survived the winter without a single pothole. Gonchan expanded the work. 30 men continued paving the road toward Volsona. Crushed stone, lime mixture, tamping. Every day, the road grew by 200 meters. By summer, Gonchan expected to extend the good road to the intersection 40 li from Hasogun. There, it joined the Imperial Highway. And the Imperial Highway led to Volson, and on to Cheonghae, and on to the capital. A road is a blood vessel. Without it, a city is dead. With it, it lives. The spring harvest confirmed everything Gonchan had promised. The wheat field yielded 1.5 times more than it had before. The pea field enriched the soil with nitrogen. The fallow field, after the goats had grazed there, was ready for the next season. The peasants stood at the edge of the field and looked at the wheat. Thick, tall. The heavy ears of grain bent toward the ground. They had never seen anything like this before. One old man said that his grandfather had told him about the harvests in Cheonghae. He said that there the wheat stood like a wall. The old man had thought it was just a fairy tale. Now it stood like a wall here, in Dusty Pit. But Hasogun was no longer Dusty Pit. Brick houses, clean water, a bridge across the river, a road, steel. People walked straighter. They looked more confident. Children played instead of wandering around with empty eyes. Women washed clothes in clean water from the canals instead of in the murky river backwater. Men worked with steel tools and accomplished in a day what used to take a week. Gonchan stood on the bridge and watched it all. 5 months since his arrival. A well, the furnace, the dam, the canals, bricks, mortar, the road, steel, the bridge, roof tiles, crop rotation. Every step led to the next. Every innovation opened the door to 3 others. This is called a technological cascade. One invention makes 10 possible. But Gonchan knew the flip side as well. Every success attracted attention, and attention in this world meant danger. The first merchants from Volsona appeared at the beginning of summer. There were 3 merchants, the Man Trading House from Volsona. The eldest of them, a stout man named Mundego, rode a mule. 2 assistants walked behind a cart loaded with goods. They had heard about Hasogun from the very same caravan driver who had traded salted fish for lime that winter. The caravan driver spoke of a mortar that bonds stones together tightly, of bricks as resonant as bells, of water as clear as a mountain stream. No one believed him. But Mundego became a merchant not because he believed rumors, but because he verified them. He drove along the new road and grew suspicious even then. Smooth, solid, not a single pothole. He had only seen roads like this in the capital province. When he entered Hasogun, he stopped his mule and sat motionless for a minute. Brick houses, tile roofs, a stone bridge across the river. water channels running from the lake to the fields, and people. Not the gaunt, ragged peasants he remembered from 2 years ago. Normal, well-fed, working. Mundego had been a merchant for 30 years. He had seen many towns. He knew the smell of poverty and the stink of wealth. Hasagun smelled of work. Fresh clay, hot iron, smoke from the smithy, bread from the ovens. Gonchan received the merchants in a house that no longer looked like a village headman's hut. The walls were lined with brick. The floor was wooden. The table and chairs were knocked together from planed boards. On the table stood a clay teapot and cups, simple but neat. Mundagil sat down and looked around. He looked at the walls, at the ceiling, at the window covered with oiled cloth. Then he looked at Gonchan, a 19-year-old boy, thin, pale, the Duke's fourth son, the very one the courtiers called an empty vessel. Diggle asked directly what the Lord wanted to sell. Gonchan replied that he didn't want to sell, but to buy. Diggle raised an eyebrow. People usually come to the seller to buy, not the other way around. Gonchan explained he needed seeds, flax, cotton, oil seeds. He needed hides, cow and pig. He needed copper ore, and tin, and saltpeter if available. Deagle listened and did the math in his head. Everything the young lord had listed was worth a pretty penny. He asked how Hasagun intended to pay. Annual income of 200 gold pieces, debt of 4,000. Where would the money come from? Gonchan stood up. He asked the merchant to come with him. They went out. Gonchan led him to the smithy. Thalsu was working. The hammer clanged. Sparks flew. Finished items hung on a rack by the wall. Steel knives, steel plowshare tips, steel axes, steel nails in a wooden box. Deagle took a knife. He turned it over in his hands. He tested the blade with his finger. He pulled his hand back. He ran it along a hair on his wrist. The hair split. Deagle put the knife back, slowly. His face changed. The mask of the good-natured fat man vanished. Beneath it was a calculating predator with 30 years of experience. He asked how many such knives the blacksmith could make in a month. Gonchan replied that currently 20. In 6 months, when the second furnace was ready, 100. Deagle fell silent. A steel knife of this quality cost 15 silver pieces at the Volson market. That's half the price of capital steel, and the quality is better. He'd seen capital steel. It couldn't cut a hair. This one could. He offered a contract. The Man Trading House would take on the supply of all the materials the Hasogun needed. In return, it would receive exclusive rights to sell steel products in Volsona. Gonchan shook his head. No exclusives. He explained the terms. The Man Trading House would receive priority. The first shipment would always go to them, but other merchants could buy as well. A free market. Competition lowers prices and increases volumes. Deagle frowned. He was used to exclusivity. That's how trade worked in the empire. One supplier, one buyer, a monopoly, a markup. Gonchan offered him something else. Instead of a sales monopoly, he's giving Deagle a transportation monopoly. The Man Trading House becomes the shogun's official carrier. All goods go through it. A fixed rate for transportation. Volumes will grow. Income will grow along with them. But he has no control over the prices of the goods. Deagle thought long and hard. He calculated. He crunched the numbers in his head. He wasn't a fool. He had seen this city. He had seen the dam and the canals and the brick houses. He had seen the steel tools. This young man was building something unprecedented. If volumes doubled from current levels, the monopoly on transportation would be worth more than the exclusive right to sell knives. And judging by what he'd seen, volumes wouldn't double. They'd increase 20-fold. He agreed. They shook hands. So-hyun wrote up the contract terms in 2 copies. Both parties affixed their seals. It was the first trade contract in the history of Hasogun. Mundegel left 2 days later. He took with him 20 steel knives and 10 plow points. 3 weeks later, he returned with wagons, seeds, hides, copper ore, tin, and saltpeter, 3 sacks. Gonchan met the caravan in person. He inspected every sack. The saltpeter was a bit dirty with impurities, but usable. He put it in a separate storage room, locked it up. Sohyun asked why he needed the saltpeter. Gonchan replied that he would explain later. She looked at him. She recorded it in the log. Book number 93. It burned. Summer was a time of growth. Hasogun's population began to increase. Refugees were coming from the south, peasants who had fled famine in neighboring counties, vagabonds, landless families. Rumors were spreading. Somewhere on the edge of the desert, there is a place where they give work and food, where the houses are made of brick and the water is clean, where the new lord doesn't beat people and doesn't take more than his share. Gonchan welcomed everyone. Every newcomer was given a day of rest and 3 bowls of porridge. Then a conversation with Sohyun. What skills you have, what you used to do. Do you have a family? Assignment to work crews. Construction, agricultural, mining, blacksmithing, roadwork. By the end of summer, the population had reached 5,000, a nearly 2-fold increase in 6 months. This created problems. More people meant more food, more houses, more water, more of everything. Gonchan scaled up. A second brick kiln, a third, a second blast furnace for Talsu, new canals from the lake, expansion of the fields to the north shore. Now that the bridge was in place, the north shore was accessible. The soil there turned out to be better than on the south side. Less rock, more topsoil. Gonchan laid out new fields there and implemented a full crop rotation scheme with compost fertilizer. The compost, matured over the winter, turned out exactly as he had promised. Dark, loose, smelling of earth, not rot. The peasants who had looked at the waste pit with disgust in the fall now looked at the compost with respect. The fields fertilized with compost yielded twice as much as the unfertilized ones. Gonchan stood next to the foreman and watched the seedlings. The foreman, the very same man who, on the first day, and asked why all this was necessary, shook his head. He said that the earth was like a woman. If you take care of her, she responds. Gonchan thought that this wasn't the most scientific analogy, but he kept quiet. Meanwhile, Mundegil brought news from Volson. The steel knives from Hasogun had caused a stir in the market. The local blacksmiths were furious, and their iron knives were inferior in every way. Merchants were fighting for the right to buy them. The price Gonchan had set was a third lower than in the capital, with better quality. Degil said that by next month he could sell twice as much, 3 times as much as he wanted. The demand was endless. Gonchan nodded, but he warned that the increase in volume would be gradual. First, tools for Hasogun himself, then for sale. His own city first and foremost. Degil didn't argue. He was already calculating future profits, and he liked what he saw. Degil also mentioned something less pleasant. In Volson, people were asking where Hasogun got his steel. The 4th son of Duke No, a disgrace to the family, an empty vessel. And suddenly, steel knives that cut hair. Some of the merchants had written letters to the capital, to Chunghae, to the Tower of the Sages. Gonchan listened in silence. He knew this would happen. Every innovation attracts attention. Steel would attract more attention than anything else. Steel is power. Whoever controls steel controls weapons. Whoever controls weapons controls the world. Previously, steel had been the monopoly of the capital's blacksmiths, who worked with ore imported from the northern provinces. Now, a boy from the desert is making better steel, from local ore. In a homemade furnace. This isn't just news, it's a threat. Ganchan returned home and sat down at the table. He took out a sheet of paper. He began to write. Not a blueprint, not a construction plan, a list of threats. First, the No family, his older brother, his father. They'll find out. The question is when. Second, the Tower of Sages. Steel doesn't yet pose a direct threat to magic, but they'll see the trend. Third, the Emperor, the most unpredictable. He might help, he might destroy it. Fourth, the neighbors, Muron beyond the desert. They don't know yet, but they will find out. Fifth, money. A debt to the treasury of 4,000 gold pieces, 200 gold pieces in income each year. If we sell steel for 1,000 gold pieces this year, the debt will be paid off in 4 years, if we make it in time. Ganchan set down his brush. He looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the hills. Orange light flooded the brick walls of the houses. Children were running across the square. A woman was carrying a jug of water from the well. Men were returning from the fields with steel hoes on their shoulders. A peaceful scene. Beautiful. Fragile. Ganchan knew the calm wouldn't last, but for now, it was there. And he was using every day of this calm to make Hasogun stronger. Because when the storm comes, and it will come, the only protection will be the walls. Stone, steel, and human. Autumn brought the harvest and guests. The harvest was magnificent. The wheat stood like a wall. The peas filled their pods to bursting. The flax, sown from seeds brought by Deagil, yielded its first crop. The oil seeds ripened on the southern slopes where Ganchan had laid out separate plots protected from the wind by movable walls. The total harvest exceeded the Hasogun's needs threefold. For the first time in the history of this district, there was not just enough food, there was a surplus. Ganchan managed the surplus precisely. A third went into strategic reserves. A brick granary with a raised floor and ventilation. He explained to Sohyun that grain spoils from moisture and mice. The raised floor prevents moisture from rising from the ground. The ventilation slits prevent the grain from spoiling, and the cats keep the mice away. Sohyun took note, and she got 4 cats, a third for sale. Moondegil took the grain along with the next shipment of steel. A third was for seeds and livestock feed. The herd had grown. The goats had multiplied. Degil brought 2 cows and a bull. Expensive, but Ganchan knew that milk and meat were needed for the growing population. The guests were less pleasant. The first to arrive was an official from the Imperial Treasury. Petty, fussy, with papers. He came to remind him of the debt. 4,000 gold pieces, an annual payment of 500. Already 3 years overdue. The total debt, with interest, was 4,800. Ganchan received him in the new administrative building, the first 2-story building in Hasogun. Brick, tile, wooden floors, glass windows. Yes, glass. Ganchan had started a glass workshop a month ago. The glass was a bit cloudy with bubbles, far from perfect, but it was there, transparent, letting light through. In a world where glass was a luxury available only to the imperial court and the Tower of the Wise, glass windows in the administrative building of a backwater county were a statement. The official saw the windows and stumbled over his words. Then he pulled himself together. He presented the bill. Ganchan looked at the numbers. Then he opened his desk drawer. He took out a pouch. He poured gold coins onto the table. 500. The annual payment. The official counted them twice. The amount was exact. He asked where Lord Hasogun had gotten such money. Ganchan replied that it was from trade. The official looked out the window at the city beyond. He wrote something in his logbook. He stamped the receipt. He left. Ganchan knew that this official's report would reach the treasury, and from the treasury, the information would spread to the emperor, to the advisors, to the great houses. The duke's fourth son had paid off the shogun's annual debt in a single installment. From a district that 3 years ago couldn't scrape together even 100 gold pieces. A wake-up call for those who know how to listen. The second guests were a delegation from Volsona, not merchants, a guild of artisans. 3 masters, a blacksmith, a potter, a carpenter. They came to look at the steel, at the bricks, at the roof tiles. Gonchan showed them everything, openly. He led them through the workshops, showed them the brick kiln, showed them the blast furnace, showed them how the arch bridge works. The masters watched and remained silent. The blacksmith from Volsona, an old and experienced man, took Thalsu's steel knife and turned it over in his hands for a long time. Then he put it back and said that in 30 years of work, he had never seen such metal. He asked how it was made. The potter explained the principle. In general terms, a blast furnace, high temperature, air blowing through it. He didn't go into details. The craftsman left deep in thought. Gonchan knew what they would tell their guild. The guild would tell the city council. The council would write to the capital. Another trickle of information. The third guest appeared unexpectedly, a rider in fine clothes, on a thoroughbred horse, with the family crest on his cloak. He arrived alone, without an entourage. He stopped in the square and asked where to find the lord. Gonchan went out to meet him. The horseman dismounted and introduced himself. Gonmin had sent him, a personal messenger from his older brother. He handed over a letter. Gonchan unrolled the scroll. Gonmin's handwriting was beautiful and confident, the calligraphy of the first son. The letter was short. Gonmin wrote that he had heard of the changes in Hasogun, that he was happy for his younger brother, that he would like to visit in person to see it with his own eyes. He would arrive in a month, with a small entourage. He asked that guest quarters be prepared. Gonchan read it twice. Every word was polite. Every sentence exuded venom. Gonmin was not pleased. Gonmin was testing him. Rumors of the steel from Hasogun had reached Chonghae. The older brother, whose income from the province was 10 times that of Hasogun, wanted to see for himself if it was true that his younger brother was surpassing him. Gonchan folded the letter. He told the messenger that his brother would be received with due honors. The messenger nodded and left. Sohyun stood nearby and read the letter over his shoulder. She said this wasn't a courtesy visit. Gonchan replied that he knew. She asked what he was going to do. Gonchan paused. Then he said he would show his brother everything. Every house, every furnace, every canal. There was no point in hiding anything. The steel is already in the market. The bricks are visible from the road. The bridge stands over the river. There's nothing to hide. But he would show only what was already there, not what would be. Sohyun nodded. Then she opened the journal. The list of burned books had reached 120 titles. She said that when someone asked him to explain how a single library could contain so much diverse knowledge, Gonchan replied that it was a very large library. She looked at him for a long time. She didn't believe him, but she didn't ask. Gonchan made full use of the month before Gonmin's arrival. He launched 3 new projects. The first, a paper workshop. In this world, paper was made from silk, expensive, rare. Only 4% of the population was literate, and paper was one of the reasons. If there is no cheap paper, there are no cheap books. No books, no education. No education, no progress. Gonchan knew how to make paper from plant fibers. The flax they had grown was the ideal raw material. The stalks were soaked, they were boiled down in a lye made from wood ash. The resulting mass was pounded with hammers into a uniform pulp. The pulp was diluted with water and poured in a thin layer onto a mesh frame. It was dried in the sun, then removed. Paper. rough, yellowish, with fibers visible against the light, but paper. You can write on it, draw, print. The cost of a single sheet is 10 times lower than that of silk paper. The second project, a school. Ganchan set aside one of the new houses as a classroom. He appointed So-hyun as the teacher. She resisted. She said she was barely literate herself. He replied that she was the only literate person in Hasogun, and that made her the most qualified teacher. So-hyun snorted, but agreed. Every morning, 30 children aged 7 to 12 came to school. So-hyun taught them to read and write, on paper from her own workshop, with ink made from soot and glue, using goose quills. Gonchan wrote the textbook himself. Basic literacy, arithmetic, the basics of weights and measures, of hygiene. 30 pages, the first textbook in the history of Hasogun. The third project, the wall. Not decorative, defensive. A stone wall around the city. Gonchan understood that Hasogun's growth would attract not only merchants and officials. Gangs roamed the border with the desert. Deserters, nomads, scum from the outskirts of Muryeon. Until now, they hadn't touched Hasogun because there was nothing to take. Now there was. The wall was designed according to a simple principle: 4 meters high, 2 meters thick at the base, 1 meter at the top. Stone masonry on concrete, not on lime mortar, but on real concrete. Ganchan had finally found the right ingredient. The pumice from the Western Ravine turned out to be more than just pumice. It was volcanic tuff. Finely crushed and mixed with slaked lime, it produced a pozzolanic reaction. Roman concrete. The very same kind that has held up the Pantheon for 2,000 years. The concrete set within a day. It hardened within a week. After a month, it couldn't be broken with a sledgehammer. A wall made of this concrete would withstand a battering ram. Construction of the wall began on the south side. That's where the threat was most likely to come from. So Dao supervised the work. His crew had grown to 60 men. They worked in 2 shifts. The wall grew by 20 meters a day. When Gonmin arrived, a quarter of the wall was complete. The south side and part of the east. He arrived with 10 horsemen, his personal guard, all in armor, all with swords. Handsome, dangerous. Gonmin dismounted at the gate. He was just as Ganchan remembered him from the memories of the body's former owner. Tall, broad-shouldered, a handsome face with sharp features, eyes cold and appraising. An exact copy of his father, only younger and more vicious. He saw the wall, brick houses, a bridge, glass windows in the administrative building, a paved square, water channels, people in clean clothes with tools in their hands. Ganchan saw his face change. First, curiosity, then surprise, then confusion, then something dark and heavy. Gonmin turned to Ganchan. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. He said his younger brother had surprised him. Ganchan bowed as a younger brother should before an elder. He invited him into the house, showed him the city, led him through the workshops. Gonmin looked, touched, asked questions. The questions were how much steel the forge produced, what the annual income was, how many people worked on the wall, where the ore came from. Ganchan answered honestly, to all questions except one. When Gonmin asked where he knew all this from, Ganchan replied that he had read it in a book, a very old one. It had burned. Gonmin looked at him. He didn't believe him. He didn't press the matter. The visit lasted 3 days. Gonmin behaved impeccably, polite, courteous. He praised the wall. He admired the bridge. He tested the steel and nodded approvingly. On the 3rd day, before leaving, he remained alone with Ganchan. The smile vanished. He said his father would be displeased. The younger must not surpass the elder. That is a violation of the order. It was a disgrace to the clan. He proposed a solution. Ganchan would pass on the steelmaking technology to the clan. The family would distribute it fairly. everyone would win. Gonchan replied that the technology belonged to Hasogun, not to the clan, not to the family, to the people who lived and worked here. He would not pass it on. Gonmin looked at him for a long time, in silence. Then he said that Gonchan was making a mistake. He turned and left. An hour later, his unit left Hasogun. Gonchan stood on the wall and watched them ride away. Dust rose in a column from beneath their hooves. So-hyun stood beside him. She asked what his older brother had said. Gonchan replied that he had asked to share. She asked what he had answered. He said he had refused. So-hyun was silent for a moment. Then she said that his older brother wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Gonchan nodded. He knew. Gonmin had left, white with rage. And that was only the first wave. After Gonmin's departure, Gonchan had 2 months of silence. He knew it wasn't peace, but a pause. Gonmin went to see his father. His father would think it over. Duke No Taehaewon knew how to think slowly and heavily, like a millstone. But when the millstone turned, it ground down everything in its path. Gonchan used those 2 months with surgical precision. The wall. By the beginning of winter in the second year, it was complete. The perimeter. 4 meters high, 2 meters thick at the base. Concrete on volcanic tuff. 4 gates. North, south, east, western. Each gate made of oak logs reinforced with steel strips. Above the southern gate, Gonchan ordered a gatehouse to be built, 6 meters high, a view 15 meters out toward the desert. So Dal built the tower himself and put everything he knew into it. The walls were perfectly smooth, loopholes on every side, a spiral staircase inside. When the tower was ready, So Dal climbed to the top and stood there for half an hour, just looking. Gonchan climbed up after him. He asked why he was standing there. So Dal replied that 6 months ago, he didn't know how to lay bricks, and now he had built a tower. Gonchan slapped him on the shoulder. He said this was only the beginning. By this point, the population had surpassed 8,000. Refugees continued to arrive. But now it wasn't just starving peasants coming. Artisans were arriving, carpenters, weavers, even a single healer, an old man, half blind, with trembling hands. But he knew herbs. He knew how to set a dislocated joint and stitch up a wound. Gonchan sat him down next to him and talked for 3 hours. He asked about illnesses, about treatments, about what local medicine knew. The doctor knew a lot, and didn't know the basics. Didn't know that wounds needed to be washed. Didn't know that dirty hands spread disease. Didn't know that boiling kills germs. Gonchan told him, carefully, not as a teacher to a student, but as a colleague to a colleague. The doctor listened, at first skeptically, then attentively, then eagerly. When Gonchan explained the principle of alcohol disinfection, the doctor froze. He asked again, and asked him to repeat it. Then he said that if this were true, half the deaths from wounds in this world had been in vain. Gonchan replied that it was true. The doctor's name was Oh Byung-ho. Gonchan appointed him chief physician of the Hasogun. He gave him a room, instruments, a supply of alcohol made from fermented grain distilled through a simple still. Oh Byung-ho began his work. He washed wounds with alcohol. He boiled his instruments. He washed his hands before every examination. In the first month, he didn't lose a single wounded man. Before, 3 out of 10 wounded men died, from infection, from gangrene, from fever. Now, no one died. Oh Byung-ho walked through the city with the look of a man who had just been shown that the earth is round. Stunned, turned upside down, angry at his own past ignorance. He told everyone who would listen that they needed to wash their hands, boil water, not touch a wound with dirty fingers. People listened. They trusted the doctor more than the Lord. The doctor was old. He knew life. If he said to wash your hands, then you had to wash them. Infant mortality began to fall, slowly, but noticeably. Over the course of a year, Sohyun recorded a threefold decrease. Out of 30 newborns, 28 survived. Before, 15 to 20. Gonchan read the entry and sat in silence for a long time. 28 out of 30. 2 deaths. 2 unnecessary deaths that could have been prevented if he'd had more knowledge, more tools, more medicines. He wasn't a doctor, he was an engineer, but he knew about antiseptics, about sterility, about quarantine. And that knowledge saved 12 children who would otherwise have died. 12 children in 1 year, in one small town. He thought of the millions dying across the continent from things that could be treated with boiled water and washed hands. And he couldn't stop that thought. It burned. Meanwhile, events were accelerating. A letter from his father arrived at the beginning of the first winter month. Duke No Taehwan summoned his 4th son to the ancestral estate. The wording was dry and official, to appear in person. Within 2 weeks, matters of family inheritance. Gonchan read it and understood. Gonmin reported. His father had made his decision. He had to go. Refusal would be tantamount to rebellion against the head of the clan, and rebellion against the clan head is a formal pretext to strip him of his title of lord, and of Hasogun. He left Sohyun in charge. He gave her a list of instructions for every day of his absence. Do not stop construction. Do not shut down the furnaces. Do not close the school. He appointed So Dal-ya as construction supervisor, Talsu as head of production. He asked Hona to keep an eye on things. The old man nodded and said he would, with one hand. Gonchan smirked. The journey to the clan estate took 4 days. He rode on horseback, alone, without guards, through Volsun, along the Imperial Highway. The Duke's estate stood on a hill in the center of Cheonghae province, massive, stone, with towers and walls, an ancestral castle built 5 generations ago. Gonchan rode into the courtyard and felt eyes on him. Servants, guards, everyone was watching. The 4th son had returned, an empty vessel. Only now, rumors had preceded him. Lord Hasogun, the one who makes steel. His father received him in the main hall, one-on-one. No brothers, no advisors, just the Duke and the 4th son. But Taehaewon sat in his chair like a rock, huge, immobile. The family's silver hawk on the wall behind him. He looked at Gonchan and said nothing. A minute, 2, 3. Gonchan stood and waited. He knew this tactic, pressure through silence. In his past life, clients on construction sites did the same thing. They remained silent and waited until the contractor started to get nervous and give in. Gonchan wasn't nervous. He was an engineer. Engineers were used to pressure. Finally, the Duke spoke. He said that Gonchan was bringing shame upon the family. The youngest son must not surpass his elder. It violates the order. It violates tradition. It violates the law of the clan. He demanded that Gonchan hand over the technology to the clan. Everything. Steel, concrete, brick, glass. Everything he had created must belong to the family and be distributed according to seniority. Gonmin would receive it first, because he is the eldest. That is how the world works. Gonchan listened in silence. Then he replied, calmly, without insolence, but firmly. He said that technology is not something that can be handed down like a sack of grain. It is knowledge and skills and the people who possess them. Handing over a blueprint for a blast furnace is pointless if there is no master who knows how to operate it. Handing over a blueprint is pointless if there is no one who knows exactly what kind of stone is needed and at what temperature it should be fired. He proposed an alternative. Not a technology transfer, but a trade agreement. Hasogun supplies the clan with steel, bricks, and glass at cost, no markup. The clan receives the best materials in the empire cheaper than anyone else. Hasogun preserves production and personnel. Everyone wins. The Duke listened. His expression did not change. When Gonchan finished, the Duke spoke a single sentence. He said that Gonchan was refusing his father. Silence. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. In this world's value system, defying one's father was tantamount to treason. Gonchan replied that he was not defying him. He was proposing a better path. The Duke stood up. He was a head taller than Gonchan, twice as broad. He stepped closer. He looked down at him and said that Gonchan had 2 months. If the technology was not transferred within 2 months, the Duke would appeal to the Emperor to reconsider the appointment. Hasogun would be transferred to Gonmin. Gonchan would be recalled to the estate, without a title, without land, without anything, an empty vessel once more. Gonchan bowed and left. His hands did not tremble. His voice did not falter. But when he mounted his horse and rode out of the estate, he gripped the reins so tightly that his knuckles turned white. 2 months. On the way back, he did not stop. He rode the horse until dark. He slept for 4 hours, back in the saddle. He returned to Hasogun in 3 days instead of 4. So-hyun met him at the gate. She looked at his face and understood everything. She asked how long it had been. He replied, 2 months. She nodded. She asked what to do. Gonchan replied, work faster. 2 months isn't enough time to negotiate with the Duke, but it's enough to make Hasogun so valuable that taking it away would cost more than keeping it. He sat down at the table and began to plan. He needed to transform Hasogun from a merely successful county into an indispensable economic hub, one that couldn't be handed over to another lord without everything collapsing. Because everything doesn't rest on blueprints. Everything rests on a single person who knows why the arch doesn't fall. And that person isn't going anywhere. 2 months, 60 days. Gonchan mapped out each one. First task, the debt to the treasury. 4,000 gold pieces minus the 500 already paid equals 3,500. If he pays off the debt in full, Hasogun is formally in the clear with the empire, and a debt-free district is harder to seize. A pretext is needed. The debt could serve as a pretext. Without the debt, there are fewer pretexts. Gonchan summoned Moon Daegul. He arrived a week later. Gonchan offered him a deal. The Man Trading House would pay off Hasogun's debt to the treasury, 3,500 gold pieces. In return, it would receive a 5-year contract, exclusive rights to transportation and trade mediation, a fixed rate, prepayment for the first year's goods. Daegul did the math. 3,500 gold pieces is the annual turnover of an average trading house in Volsun. A large sum. But he had seen Hasogun. He had seen the wall, the bridge, 10,000 people, steel, glass, concrete, brick, paper, grain. If in 5 years Hasogun produces at least twice as much as it does now, and it will clearly produce 10 times as much, then this contract will pay for itself in 2 years. The remaining 3 years are pure profit. Daegul agreed. 2 weeks later, a wagon load of gold set off for the capital. The receipt for the debt payment returned a month later. Hasogun was in the clear. So-hyun made a note in the ledger. Debt fully repaid. Date, amount, source. She underlined it twice. Second task, economic dependence. Gonchan began supplying goods not only through Daegul. He opened a trading post in Hasogun. Any merchant could come and buy directly. Steel tools, bricks, roof tiles, paper, lime mortar, glass. Every item had a fixed price, standard quality. A guarantee. The word guarantee was new to this world. Gonchan explained to every buyer, if the item breaks within 6 months under normal use, we'll replace it for free. The merchants didn't believe him. Then one returned with a cracked pane of glass. Gonchan replaced it without question. The news spread instantly. Merchants flocked to Hasogun like flies to honey. Not because the goods were cheap, but because here, the Lord's word is law. If he said he'd replace it, he would. In an empire where deception was the norm in business, this was a revolution. By the end of the first month, the marketplace was open every day, 20 to 30 merchants at a time. Carts lined the road, tents sprang up beyond the wall. Gonchan introduced standardized weights and measures. 1 Hasogun pound is exactly 450 grams. 1 Hasogun cubit is exactly 50 centimeters. All scales in the city were calibrated to a standard kept in the administrative building. At first, the merchants were outraged. They were used to every city having its own measures. In Vol, a pound is 400 grams. In Chonghae, 420. In the capital, 450. The difference allowed for cheating, buying by the larger pound, selling by the smaller one. Gonchan eliminated that possibility. In Hasogun, 1 pound is 1 pound. Everywhere. Always. For everyone. The merchants protested for a week. Then they understood. A standard is not a restriction. A standard is trust. If you know that a Hasogun pound is always the same, you can plan, calculate, not fear being cheated. Trade in Hasogun became easier and more predictable than anywhere else in the empire, and the merchants appreciated that. The third task, the population. Gonchan understood that more people were needed. 10,000 is good, but not enough. He needed a city, not a village. He sent messengers to neighboring counties. The announcements were simple. Hasogun welcomes everyone. Housing, work, protection. Every artisan receives a workshop and tools for a year free of charge. In exchange, 20% of the output goes to the city. After a year, the workshop becomes his property. The terms were unprecedented. In the empire, artisans paid guilds for the right to work. They paid lords for the right to live. They paid taxes to the treasury. But here, they were given a workshop for free. And tools, steel ones. People came. Blacksmiths, potters, weavers, leatherworkers, bricklayers, carpenters, even a single jeweler. Within 2 months, the population reached 12,000. Hasogun ceased to be a village. It became a city. The fourth task, information. Gonchan launched the first issue of the newspaper. No, not a newspaper, a bulletin. 1 page weekly, printed on paper produced locally. The content was simple. Prices for goods in Hasogun, job listings, schedule of market days, news. A new house was built. A new workshop opened. The school was enrolling students. The bulletin was distributed through merchants. Each received 10 copies for free. They took them back to their own towns. They showed them to their acquaintances. A month later, the Hasogun bulletin was being read in Volson. 2 months later, in Chonghae. It was an advertisement, the most primitive form of marketing. But in a world where information was transmitted only through rumors, even a 1-page bulletin with precise figures was a weapon. Every merchant who read that a steel knife cost 10 silver coins in Hasogun and 25 in the capital thought the same thing. We must go to Hasogun. The fifth task, the most secret one, gunpowder. Gonchan began his work quietly, in a separate workshop outside the city, at the foot of the western hill, far from residential buildings. 1 assistant, a silent young man, a former vagrant named Chui Mugan. Talsu knew. So Hyun knew. No one else. There was saltpeter. 3 sacks from DeGill, plus what they managed to extract from the latrines. Nitrate forms when organic matter decomposes in the presence of alkali. Gonchan gathered leach soil from under old latrines. He washed it. He evaporated it. He got crystals. Dirty ones, with impurities. But it was saltpeter. There was sulfur. Yellow crystals in the crevices of the western ravine. He'd found them back in the first week. Getting them wasn't hard. Cleaning them was harder. He distilled the sulfur using the simplest distillation method. He heated it. He collected the vapors on a cold surface. pure yellow crystals. There was coal, wood charcoal, from those same coal pits. The recipe was simple: 75 parts of saltpeter, 15 parts coal, 10 parts sulfur. Grind each component into the finest powder. Mix, moisten, granulate, dry. He mixed the first batch himself, by hand, in a stone mortar, thoroughly, carefully. Chui Muhan stood nearby and watched suspiciously. He didn't know what it was. Gonchan said it was a new formula for signal fires. A half-truth. He conducted the first test at night. He poured a fist-sized mound of powder onto a stone. He led Muhan behind cover. He lit it with a long fuse. A flash, a roar, a cloud of smoke. The rock on which the gunpowder lay split in two. Muhan fell to the ground and covered his head with his hands. Then he got up. He looked at the split rock, at the smoke, at Gonchan. His eyes were huge. He asked what that was. Gonchan said it was a force that would change the world, and that Mugan would tell no one what he had seen. No one. Ever. Mugan nodded. He was one of those people who knew how to keep quiet. That was why Gonchan had chosen him. The gunpowder worked. The formula was correct. The granulation ensured even combustion. The power was sufficient. Now a weapon was needed. But that was the next step. First, he had to get through his father's visit. 2 months had passed. No letter had arrived. Instead of a letter, the Duke himself had come. No, not the Duke, Gonmin, with a detachment of 50 horsemen, and with a document bearing the Duke's signature and the clan's seal. A decree transferring control of Hazogun from No Gonchan to No Gonmin. The formal reason: the younger son's inability to govern the territory in accordance with the clan's interests. Gonmin stood at the gate and smiled. Behind him were 50 swordsmen, the best warriors of Chonghe, professionals. Opposing them in Hazogun were peasants with hoes. Gonchan stood on the wall and looked down. Sohyun was beside him. Talsu stood behind him, a steel hammer in his hand. Hong stood with one hand free and a knife at his belt. Sodal stood with a dozen builders. Everyone had gathered. Everyone was waiting. Gonchan looked at Gonmin, at his horsemen, at the document in his hand. Then he turned to Sohyun and asked her to bring the receipt for the debt payment, and the trade contracts, and the census. Sohyun brought them a minute later. She had everything ready. She knew this day would come. Gonchan went down to the gate. He opened it. He went out to meet his brother alone. Gonmin handed him the document. Gonchan took it. He read it. Then he took out his own papers, a receipt for full repayment of the debt, 37 trade contracts with merchants from 12 cities, the census, 12,000 residents, the annual tax report. Hasogun's income, 1,200 gold pieces, 6 times more than a year ago. And the final document, a petition, signed by every head of household in Hasogun, 3,000 signatures and fingerprints. The text was simple. We, the residents of Hasogun, ask the Imperial Chancellery to keep Lord No Gonchan as our ruler. He gave us water, homes, work, food, protection. We do not want another lord. Gonmin read the petition. His face froze. The document from the Duke gave him the right to take Hasogun. But a petition from 12,000 residents sent to the Imperial Chancellery turned this into a scandal. If he enters by force against the will of the people, it is a rebellion. Not his rebellion, a rebellion by the people he was trying to subdue. The Emperor does not like rebellions. The Emperor likes noble houses that provoke rebellions even less. Gonchan stood calmly. He did not threaten. He did not shout. He simply held the papers. Gonmin looked at him, at the wall behind him, at the faces of the people on the wall, peasants, artisans, women, children. Everyone looked down, silently. Gonmin clenched his teeth. He turned his horse around. His squad moved away. 50 horsemen rode off along the road that Gonchan had built, across the bridge that Gonchan had built, past the fields that Gonchan had sown. So-hyun stood beside him. She said she had prepared the petition a week ago, just in case. Gonchan looked at her. He asked how she knew Gonmin would arrive with a decree rather than a letter. So-hyun replied that she didn't know, but she knew her older brother wasn't the type to write twice. Gonchan nodded. Then he said this wasn't the end. Gonmin had retreated but hadn't given up. He would return, or find another way. So-hyun nodded. She knew that too. But today they had stood their ground, and tomorrow would be tomorrow. Gonmin had retreated, but the silence after his departure was deceptive. Gonchan knew the blow would come from another direction. The petition had stopped his brother, but not his father. Duke No Tae-hwan was not used to losing, and he certainly wasn't used to losing to his fourth son. But Gonchan had no time to wait for the family's next move. He was expecting another guest, and the guest arrived. 3 weeks after Gonmin's departure, a merchant's wagon from the southern lands entered Hasogun. Behind it came 2 mules laden with bales of silk and spices. The driver was an older man with a weather-beaten face. A young woman sat beside him, 22 years old. Dark hair tied in a simple knot. A merchant's attire. Expensive fabric, but a modest cut. She looked around with such delight that she forgot to close her mouth. She looked at a wall and her eyes widened. She looked at the brick houses and began counting under her breath. She looked at the bridge and pulled a small notebook from her sleeve, quickly sketching. Right in plain sight of everyone, she was the worst spy in the history of espionage. Her name was Yun Nadi, Princess of the Kingdom of Murung, daughter of King Yun Tae-son, sister of General Yun Tae-woo, sent by her father under the guise of a merchant to find out if the rumors about the wondrous city on the border were true. Gonchan found out about her 2 days after her arrival. So-hyun reported that the new merchant was asking too many questions. She's interested in the wall, the smithy, the furnaces, and she's writing everything down in a notebook. Gonchan came to see for himself. Nadi was standing by Talsu's blast furnace, sketching it in her notebook, in detail, with dimensions she measured in steps. Talsu stood nearby, watching her with the expression of someone observing a kitten trying to catch a fly. Gonchan approached. Nadi saw him and hid the notebook behind her back, quickly, awkwardly. The notebook fell and opened to the page with the furnace drawing. Silence hung in the air. Nadi picked up the notebook, pressed it to her chest, looked at Gonchan. Gonchan looked at her. He knew who she was, a Muron accent, hands without calluses, the posture of someone who had been taught to sit up straight since childhood, expensive fabric, a silk-clad spy with a notebook. He said that if she wanted to draw the furnace, she should come closer. From that distance, the proportions would be inaccurate. Nadi blinked. Then she approached cautiously. Then she began to draw. Thalsu shook his head and went back to work. Thus began a strange coexistence. Nari walked around the city and wrote everything down. Gonchan knew. She knew that he knew. He knew that she knew that he knew. Both pretended that nothing was happening. She was a merchant. He was a hospitable lord. Period. Gonchan didn't chase her away for 2 reasons. First, the information she could gather was useless without context. A blueprint for a blast furnace is worthless if you don't know what ore to load, at what temperature to smelt it, how to blow air through it, and how to distinguish finished cast iron from undercooked. Thalsu knew that. Gonchan knew that. The notebook didn't. The second reason was strategic. Muron was a military state beyond the desert. 20,000 cavalry, a warlike king, an ambitious general. Sooner or later, they would look at Hasogun and see a prize. Gonchan preferred that they first see a trade opportunity. Nari was the conduit. Through her, he could show Murion what he wanted to show and hide what needed to be hidden. That is why he showed her the wall and the bricks and the bridge and the glass, and did not show her the workshop behind the western hill where Cho Muhan quietly ground saltpeter. Nari turned out to be not only a poor spy, but also a good conversationalist. She was smart, well educated by Murion standards. She spoke 2 languages, she knew history, she knew mathematics, and she was genuinely delighted by what she saw. It wasn't an act. Gonchan could tell the difference between calculated interest and genuine delight. Nari was delighted. She stood in front of the arched bridge and asked how the stones held up without support from above. Gonchan explained the principle of the arch. Nari listened with her mouth agape. Then she said that in Murion, the bridges were wooden and were washed away every spring. Gonchan replied that stone lasts longer. She looked at him. Then why doesn't anyone build with stone anymore? Gonchan shrugged. Because no one has read the right books. Nari laughed. Then she asked what kind of books. Gonchan replied that they were old, burnt. Nari stopped laughing. She looked closely. She wrote something down in her notebook. Meanwhile, Gonchan didn't stop making progress. The year was coming to an end, his first full year in Hasogun. He took stock. Population 12,000. It had been 3,200, a 4-fold increase. Revenue 1,200 gold pieces. It had been 200, a 6-fold increase. Debt 0. It had been 4,000. Steel production 120 units per month. It had been 0. Brick production 10,000 bricks per month. It had been 0. The grain harvest was 3 times higher than the empire-wide average for the same area. Literacy rate, 12%. It had been 0. Infant mortality has fallen by 2/3. 0 epidemics. The figures were impressive. And Gonchan knew that each one was a target on his back. He moved on to the next phase. The gunpowder was ready. The formula was perfected. 200 pounds of dry gunpowder in stock. Now he needed a weapon. Gonchan spent 3 nights poring over blueprints. A musket. The simplest matchlock musket. A cast steel barrel. Barrel length, 80 centimeters. Caliber, 20 millimeters. Matchlock mechanism. The stock is wooden. The principle is simple. Gunpowder is poured into the barrel. A lead or stone bullet is placed on top. It is rammed down with a ramrod. The fuse is lit. The trigger lowers the burning fuse into the ignition hole. The gunpowder ignites. The bullet flies. The effective range is 150 meters. The best bow in the Empire has a range of 100 meters. A mid-tier fire mage has a range of 80. A musket shoots farther than a bow and farther than a mage. But range isn't the main thing. The main thing is how quickly you can learn. It takes 5 years of training to become an archer. It takes 15 years and natural talent to become a fire mage. To become a musketeer, it takes 3 weeks and any peasant. 3 weeks. Gonchan brought the blueprint to Thalsu. The blacksmith stared at it for a long time. He already knew about gunpowder. Gonchan had shown him the test a month ago. Thalsu hadn't slept for 2 days after that. He paced around the smithy, muttering to himself. Then he went to Gonchan and said he understood. Gunpowder is the power of fire without a mage. Gonchan nodded. Exactly. Thalsu took the musket blueprint and went into the smithy. He cast the first barrel in a week. The method was complicated. First, a wax model of the barrel. Then, a clay mold around the wax. Firing the mold. The wax flows out. A cavity remains. Pouring in liquid steel. Cooling. Breaking the mold. Removing the barrel. A problem. The first barrel had cavities. Air bubbles in the walls. It's dangerous to fire from one like that. It'll explode. Thalsu threw it away and started over. Second barrel. Smaller cavities, but they're still there. Thalsu discarded it. Third. Cavities. Fourth. Fifth. Sixth. Thalsu didn't give up. He adjusted the pouring temperature and the thickness of the mold walls, the cooling rate. On the seventh attempt, the barrel came out clean. No cavities. The walls were smooth. The bore was straight. Thalsu examined it from all sides. He blew through it. He looked at the bore. He tapped it. The sound was clear, even. He showed it to Ganchan. Ganchan examined it, weighed it in his hand. Heavy, about 4 kilograms per barrel, but sturdy. The first test shot was fired behind the western hill, at night. Ganchan, Thalsu, Mugen, no one else. They loaded the musket, a powder charge, a lead bullet. Ganchan rejected the stone one. Lead is softer. It deforms in the barrel. It fills the bore more tightly. It flies more accurately. There wasn't much lead, but it was enough for the test. Thalsu lit the fuse. He rested the musket on his shoulder as Ganchan had shown him. He aimed at a wooden shield 100 meters away. He pulled the trigger. A roar shattered the night silence. A flame burst from the barrel. A cloud of smoke. The recoil pushed Thalsu back a step. He steadied himself. He looked at the shield. The bullet had pierced it right through. It entered the tree behind it. Thalsu slowly lowered the musket. He looked at Ganchan. His face was pale. He said that this changed everything. Ganchan replied that this was precisely why no one must know about it. For now. Thalsu nodded. He understood. A bow and a sword are weapons that can be countered by another bow and another sword. A musket is a weapon that cannot be countered. Not yet. Not until it is copied. And to copy it, one must know the formula for gunpowder and the technology for casting barrels. Time. Months. Perhaps years. Ganchan returned to the city. His heart was heavy. In his past life, Park Joon-ho had built bridges. Bridges connect. A musket kills. He had created a weapon in a world that didn't know it. He understood the necessity. Without muskets, Hasogun would not survive the first serious attack. The wall would delay, but not stop the army. But muskets would stop it. Yet every time he thought about the formula for gunpowder, other formulas surfaced in his mind. TNT, dynamite, napalm, nuclear fission. He knew where this was leading. He knew the final destination of this path. And yet he kept walking it. Because dysentery kills here and now, and the atomic bomb in 500 years. He had no right to choose a comfortable pace for other people's children. At night, he lay on the roof and looked up at the sky. The Milky Way blazed from horizon to horizon. Quiet, beautiful, peaceful. Somewhere down below, in Thalsu's smithy, a second barrel was being cast. Somewhere in the workshop, Muhan was grinding saltpeter. Somewhere in a room, So-hyun was recording lead expenses in a ledger. The world was changing. Quietly. Imperceptibly. Irreversibly. The spring of the second year brought 2 events. The first was good. The second was not. The good event, the harvest. The fields, cultivated using the 3-field system with compost fertilizer and steel plows, yielded unprecedented results. The wheat stood waist high. The ears were heavy and full. The peas filled the pods so full that they get on the stems. The flax grew taller than a man. The oil seeds on the southern slopes glowed with yellow flowers stretching to the horizon. The harvest exceeded the city's needs 4-fold. 4-fold. Hasogun was now doing more than just feeding himself. He could feed others. Gonchan sent the first grain convoy to Volsin via Moondegil. 100 sacks of wheat, 50 sacks of peas, 20 bales of flax. The convoy left in the morning. It returned 2 weeks later with gold and supplies. Copper, tin, dyes, spices, fabrics. And news. Bad news. The Tower of Sages had sent an observer. His name was Kwan Sonu, 35 years old, a third circle mage, specializing in water. He arrived in Hasagun riding a white horse, clad in a blue robe with silver runes. Majestic. Haughty. With a letter signed by the Supreme Sage Cho Huisong. The letter stated that the tower was concerned about rumors of unusual phenomena in Hasagun, explosions, new materials, metal superior to imperial steel. The tower is sending an observer to investigate the situation. Cooperation is encouraged. Gonchan read the letter and understood the subtext. Cooperation is welcome meant cooperation is mandatory. The Tower of Sages was not merely an organization of mages. It was a monopoly. The Empire's sole legal monopoly on supernatural powers. Mages healed. Mages built. Mages fought. For every service, the tower charged a fee, a huge one. A water mage could fill a well in an hour. Cost 50 gold. A fire mage could melt ore with a glance. Cost 100 gold. A healer could cure the plague in a village. Cost 500 gold. The Empire depended on the tower. The tower depended on that dependence. And now a boy in the desert was building wells without a water mage, smelting ore without a fire mage, curing diseases with boiled water without a healer. And he was doing it cheaper, hundreds of times cheaper. Kwan Sonu rode into the city and stopped in the square. He looked around. His face remained impassive, but Gonchan noticed his fingers tightening on the reins. The mage saw glass windows, brick walls, water channels, paved streets. All of this had been built without a single drop of mana. Gonchan received him in the administrative building, offered tea. Kwan Sonu sat down and was silent for a long time. Then he spoke. He was more direct than Gonchan had expected. He said that the tower was not the enemy. The tower wanted to understand how Lord Hasaguna achieved what usually requires magic, without magic. This is an important question. If the answer is safe for the balance of the world, the tower will not interfere. If it is dangerous, the tower will take action. Gonchan listened. Then he replied cautiously. He said he does not use magic because he has no mana. Everyone knows that. He uses knowledge. The laws of nature that work the same for everyone. Water flows down. Fire melts stone. An arch bears weight. This is not magic. It is observation. Kwan Sonu looked at him for a long time. His eyes were cold. He said that observation is not an explanation. How is it that the Duke's fourth son, whom everyone had considered hopeless his entire life, suddenly knows what the sages of the tower, with their 1,000-year history, do not know? Gonchan replied that the sages of the tower study mana. He studies matter. They are different disciplines, not contradictory. Kwan Sonu raised an eyebrow. He asked where he had learned this. Gonchan looked him in the eye. In a book. A very old one. It burned. The mage did not smile. He stood up. He said he would remain in Hasagun for an indefinite period. He would observe, not interfere, just watch. He asked to be provided with lodging. Gonchan provided it. One of the new brick houses, with a glass window, with a stove, with clean water from a well. Kwan Sonu inspected the house. He touched the walls. He looked through the glass. He turned on the faucet. Yes, a water supply. Gonchan had installed it a month ago. Ceramic pipes, glazed on the inside. Water flowed by gravity from a reservoir on the hill. The reservoir was filled from the lake via a canal. The pressure was low, but sufficient for water to flow from the tap. A water magician cost 50 gold pieces to fill a single well. Gonchan's water supply provided water to the entire city for free, forever. Kwan Sonu turned the tap back. The water stopped flowing. He stared at the faucet for a long time. Then he left without saying a word. Gonchan knew that every day the mage stayed in the city meant a report to the tower. And every report would contain the same thing. Hasogun's technologies are replacing magic. Cheaper, more reliable, more extensive. The question was how the tower would react. Observation was the first step. As for what would be the second, Gonchan preferred not to guess, but to prepare. He sped up musket production. Thalsu cast the barrels. After the 7th attempt, he got the hang of it, and now every barrel came out clean. 2 barrels a week. Carpenters made the wooden stocks. Mugan under Thalsu's supervision. By early summer, Gonchan had 20 muskets. He began training. He selected 40 men. Young, strong, capable of following orders. Not warriors, peasants, hunters, fishermen. People who knew how to stand still and do as they were told. Training took place behind the western hill, far from the city, far from Quan's son, far from Nari, who was still wandering the city with her notebook. Gonchan personally led the sessions. Formation, loading, aiming, fire, reload, formation, reload again, fire again. 4 hours every day. The first week, people were afraid of the roar. They pulled their hands away from the trigger. They closed their eyes when the shot rang out. By the second week, they had gotten used to it. By the third week, they started hitting the target, a simple wooden shield 100 meters away. By the end of the month, 8 out of 10 bullets hit the shield. That was enough. A musket is not a sniper weapon. A musket is a weapon of volley fire. 40 men fire at once. Even if half of them miss, 20 bullets into a line of cavalry means 20 fallen horses. 20 horses means chaos in the ranks. Chaos in the ranks means victory. Gonchan divided the 40 musketeers into 2 rows. The first row fires. The second reloads. The first steps back. The second steps forward and fires. The first has reloaded in the meantime. They move forward. Continuous fire. In Europe, this was called a caracole. Here, it was called nothing because it didn't exist here. Yet. Meanwhile, Nari was becoming a problem. Not because she was spying, Gonchan was used to that, but because she started helping out, without being asked. She saw that the school was short on teachers. She went to Sohyun and offered her services. She knew math. She knew it well, better than anyone in Hasogun except Gonchan himself. Sohyun looked at her suspiciously, then at Gonchan. Gonchan nodded. Nari started teaching. The children liked her. She was cheerful, patient. She explained complex things in simple words. She drew funny pictures on the board so the children would remember the numbers. Within a month, she knew every child's name in the school. Gonchan watched. He felt uneasy. Nari was a spy from a hostile state. In 6 months, her father could send an army, and she was teaching the children of Hasogun to count. The world was unfairly complicated. One evening, she approached him by the wall. He was standing there watching the sunset. She stood beside him. She was silent for a moment. Then she said she had written a letter to her father. Gonchan didn't turn around. He asked what she had written. She replied that she had written the truth, that Hasogun was a place that shouldn't exist, that a single man, without magic and without an army, had built what entire kingdoms had failed to build, that the walls were stronger than those in the capital of Murion, that the steel was better than that of the finest blacksmiths, that the children here were learning to read and count, that water flowed from the wall through pipes, that she had never seen anything like it. Gonchan asked what else she had written. She paused for a moment. Then she said, "Don't attack Hasogun. Just trust me. Don't attack." Gonchan turned to her. She was looking at him seriously, without a smile, without a notebook. He asked if her father would listen to her. Nari didn't answer. She turned away and left. Gonchan remained on the wall. He knew the answer. King Mirion would not listen to his daughter. General Yan Te-wu wouldn't listen to his sister. 20,000 cavalrymen wouldn't stop because of a letter from a girl who had fallen in love with a foreign city. The storm was approaching, and Gonchan was preparing for it the only way he knew how. He was building. The summer of the second year was hot and oppressive. Gonchan was working on 4 fronts simultaneously. Front 1, the economy. Hasogun's trading hub had become the largest market in the southwestern part of the empire. 30 to 40 merchants every day, new faces every week. From Wolson, from Namwan, from Tongram, even from the capital. The steel tools were selling out faster than Thalsu could forge them. Gonchan solved the scaling problem. Instead of a single master blacksmith, he set up a production line. Thalsu smelted the steel and made the blanks. The 4 apprentices he had trained over the course of a year forged the blanks into finished products. Each specialized in one type. The first made knives, the second plows, the third axes, the fourth made nails and small hardware. Division of labor. Adam Smith in the Middle Ages. Production increased 5-fold, from 30 units a month to 150. Gonchan introduced paper receipts. Not money, not yet money. Receipts backed by grain from the strategic reserve. One receipt is equal to 10 pounds of wheat, can be exchanged at the granary at any time, can be used for payment within the Hasogun. The merchants laughed at first. A piece of paper instead of gold. Then one tried to exchange it. He received grain, exactly 10 pounds. No trickery. A second tried. A third. By the end of summer, the receipts were circulating within the city on par with silver. Gonchan didn't push it. Let them get used to it. In a year, he would introduce full-fledged paper money. But first, trust. Front 2. Infrastructure. The water supply worked, but Gonchan wanted more. Sewerage. In a medieval city, sewage flowed through the streets. Diseases, stench, flies, rats. The plague began with the sewer system, or rather with its absence. He designed underground channels, ceramic pipes glazed on the inside, a 2 centimeter per meter slope. Sewage flowed by gravity beyond the city limits into a settling tank. There it decomposed. The liquid was filtered through sand and gravel. After 6 months, the solid residue became fertilizer, a closed cycle. The construction of the sewer system took 2 months, so Dal oversaw it. His crew, which had started with 10 men and crooked bricks, now numbered 120 builders, and worked with a precision that would have been the envy of master craftsmen in the capital. When the sewer system began operating, the smell in the city changed. People didn't immediately realize what exactly had changed. Then they realized. It didn't stink. For the first time in the history of this settlement, the streets didn't stink. Oh Byung-ho, the doctor, walked through the town and wept with joy. He knew that sewage was linked to disease. Now the sewage was going underground. He predicted that there would be no epidemics this year. He was right. Front 3, education. The school had grown. 3 classes, 90 students, 3 teachers. So-hyun taught reading and writing. Nari taught math. The 3rd teacher, a former monk named Jung Woo-hyun, taught history and the basics of law. Gonchan personally taught 1 lesson a week, the basics of natural science. Why water boils, why a stone falls downward, why an arch supports weight. Simple questions with not so simple answers. The children listened as if spellbound. To them, the world was full of magic and spirits. A stone falls because the spirit of the earth pulls it down. Water boils because the spirit of fire is angry. Gonchan didn't argue with the spirits. He demonstrated experiments. He dropped a stone and a feather from the same height. The stone falls faster. Not because the spirit of the earth loves the stone more, but because the air hinders the feather. In a vacuum, they would fall at the same time. The children asked what a vacuum was. Gonchan smiled and said that was a topic for the next lesson. He wasn't building a city. He was building a generation. People who, in 10 years, would think differently, not through magic and spirits, but through cause and effect, through observation and experiment, through numbers and facts. This was more important than steel, more important than gunpowder, more important than walls. A wall will stand for 100 years. Knowledge will live forever. The fourth front, the military. 40 musketeers trained every day. By midsummer, they had become a combat unit. Formation, volley, reload, second volley. The time between volleys was reduced to 30 seconds. 20 fire, 20 reload. They switched places after 30 seconds. Continuous fire. Gonchan added grenades to the muskets, simple ones. A clay pot filled with gunpowder and small stones. A fuse. Light it and throw. 10-meter blast radius. Not fatal at the edge of the radius, but horses are frightened by the explosion. A rider on a frightened horse is a target, not a threat. He also made signal rockets. A bamboo tube stuffed with gunpowder and metal filings. Light it from the bottom. The rocket soars 100 meters. A bright flash is visible 20 li away. Communication, coordination, warning. Quan Sanu, the observer mage, noticed something. He hadn't seen the muskets or the training, but he sensed it. Mages could sense disturbances in the flow of mana. Gunpowder contained no mana, but the explosion created a shockwave that vibrated through the mana field. One morning, Quan Sanu went to see Gonchan. He sat down across from him. He looked him in the eyes. He said he felt strange vibrations coming from the western hill, like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. He asked what it was. Gonchan replied that landslides sometimes occurred in the hills. Rocks fall. The sound carries far. Quan Sanu looked at him. He didn't believe it, but he didn't press the issue. He stood up and left. Gonchan knew what the mage would write in his report. Strange vibrations. Possible source unknown. Further observation required. That was bad. The tower would start digging deeper. It would send someone more experienced, or take more aggressive action. Time was running out. In the middle of summer, a letter arrived from the emperor, not from the chancellery, not from an advisor, personally from Emperor Huang Do-hyun, the seal of the twin dragons, gold ink, paper made of the finest silk. Gonchan unfolded the letter and read it for a long time. The emperor wrote in a flowery style, many polite turns of phrase, many hints. The gist was simple. The emperor had heard of Hasogun's achievements. He was impressed. He invited Lord No Gonchan to the capital for an audience. He proposed discussing possible cooperation for the good of the empire. He wished to see him in person, not an order, an invitation. But an invitation from the emperor differed from an order only in wording. It could not be refused. It could not be ignored. It could be delayed, but not for long. Gonchan replied with a letter. He expressed his gratitude for the honor. He conveyed his deepest respect. He requested a postponement until the end of the autumn harvest. Personal matters require the Lord's presence, with the utmost respect. He sent it by messenger. He bought some time. 3 months, maybe 4. Then he'll have to go. And in the capital, an offer awaits him that cannot be refused. The title of Imperial Minister of Development. All technology becomes the property of the crown. Gonchan becomes a prisoner in a golden cage, and Hasogun will come to a standstill without him, because the knowledge is in one man's head, and that man cannot be in 2 places at once. Gonchan sat at the table and thought. Outside the window, Hasogun went about its business. The clang of hammers, the creak of carts, children's laughter from the school, the clang of steel from the smithy, the murmur of water in the canals. 13,000 people, a city that didn't exist a year ago. He stood up and went out into the street. He walked across the cobblestone square, past the market stalls, past the new houses, past the workshops, past the school from which came the sound of Nari explaining fractions to the children, past the smithy where Thalsu was scolding an apprentice for a crooked piece of metal, past the granary where Sohyun was counting sacks, past the wall where Sodal was laying the final stones in the gatehouse of the eastern gate, past the infirmary where Oh Byung-ho was bandaging a builder's arm, past the well where Old Man Hong sat on a rock and told the children how the Lord had arrived a year ago with a single skinny horse and a handful of clay in his fist. Gonchan listened without stopping. Hong told how the Lord had said one word, enough. And since then, he hadn't stopped once. Gonchan walked on. He climbed the wall. He stood on the southern tower. He looked south. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, beyond the desert, lay the border of Murion. 20,000 cavalry, General Yon Tae-u. He knew what Nari had written to her father. He knew her father wouldn't listen. He knew the cavalry would advance. The question wasn't whether there would be a war. The question was when. And he had 40 musketeers and 20 muskets. Not enough. He needed more. Much more. He climbed down from the wall and went to Thalsu. He said they needed to speed things up. 100 muskets by spring. Thalsu looked at him. He said it was impossible. 2 barrels a week was his limit. Gonchan replied that then they needed to expand the forge. More furnaces, more people, more coal, more ore. Thalsu was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. He said he needed 10 more apprentices. Gonchan promised 20. The fall of the second year was when everything picked up speed. The population had surpassed 15,000. New people arrived every week. No longer just peasants and vagabonds, the younger sons of merchant families, bankrupt artisans from distant cities, former soldiers looking for work, a former official from Volsona who had fled his debts. Gonchan accepted everyone, but now with a condition. Every newcomer underwent a week-long quarantine. Oh Byung-ho examined them. The sick were treated. The healthy were sent for assignment. Quarantine saved the city twice. The first time was when a group of refugees from the south brought a fever. Oh Byung-ho identified the sick on the very first day. He isolated them. He treated them. Plenty of fluids, fever-reducing decoctions made from willow bark. Gonchan knew that willow bark contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. He couldn't explain it with the word aspirin. He told Oh Byung-ho that willow bark reduces fever. Just trust me. Oh Byung-ho trusted him. The fever did not spread beyond the quarantine zone. Not a single resident of the city fell ill. The second time, a merchant from Namwon brought dysentery with him. Oh Byung-ho recognized the symptoms instantly. By this point, he already knew that dirty water and unwashed hands spread the disease. The merchant was isolated. His goods were treated with boiling water. The cart was washed. The dysenteritis did not go away. Gonchan stood next to Oh Byung-ho as he reported. The doctor said that in his entire life, he had never seen a disease that could be stopped before it began. Before, he would arrive when people were already dying. Now, he arrived before they fell ill. That changed everything. Gonchan nodded. It's called prevention. Oh Byung-ho asked him to repeat the word. He wrote it down. He hung it on the wall of the clinic. Prevention. Meanwhile, the printing press was up and running. Gonchan had spent 3 months building it. The principle was simple. Wooden type. Each character carved from hardwood in a mirror image. The type is set into a frame. The frame is covered with ink. Paper is placed on top. It is pressed down. A print. 1 page in 3 minutes. 100 pages in 5 hours. Compared to 1 page per hour when copying by hand. A 20-fold increase in speed. The first printed publication was a textbook. the very one Gonchan had written for the school. 30 pages, 100 copies. So-hyun held the first copy in her hands and said nothing, for a long time. Then she said that in the Empire, a single handwritten textbook costs 20 gold pieces. This one costs 2 silver pieces. Gonchan replied that soon it would cost even less, when he switched to metal type. The second publication was a newsletter. Now, not just 1 page, but 4, with news, with prices, with a schedule, with advertisements, and with one new section: advice. How to store grain properly, how to treat a cold, how to determine the quality of steel. Practical knowledge printed on cheap paper and distributed through merchants throughout the southwestern part of the empire. Gonchan named the bulletin the Hasogun Herald. A month later, it was being read in Volsene. 2 months later, at the emperor's court. The herald became a weapon. Not a deadly one, an informational one. Every issue said the same thing. The Hasogun exists. The Hasogun is growing. Hasogun is working. Come, trade, live. In a world where information was the monopoly of the nobility, a free newsletter with accurate figures was a revolution equal to the invention of gunpowder, perhaps even greater. Gonchan knew this. In his past life, Park Jun-ho had seen how the internet changed the world. The printing press was the internet of this world. Primitive, but it worked. In mid-autumn, what Gonchan had both waited for and feared happened. A gang from the desert attacked a trade caravan. 20 li from Hasogun, 60 horsemen. Nomads from the outskirts of Muryeong. Moon Daegil's caravan. 10 wagons of goods. A guard of 20 men with swords and spears. Against 60 horsemen, that was nothing. Daegil sent a messenger to Hasogun. The messenger rode into the city shouting that the caravan was surrounded. Gonchan made his decision in a minute. He summoned 40 musketeers, formed them into a column. 20 muskets, 20 grenades, ammunition, fuses. They set out immediately. At a run, 20 or so miles in 2 hours. When they arrived, the caravan was still holding out. The wagons were arranged in a circle. The guards were behind the wagons. Bandits were circling around, shooting arrows. They didn't attack head-on. They waited until the defenders ran out of strength. Gonchan deployed the musketeers in a line on the hill above the road, 200 meters from the bandits, too far for an aimed shot. He ordered them to move closer, 150 meters, 120, 100. The bandits spotted them. They turned. They saw the infantry, 40 men with sticks. That's how they saw the muskets. Sticks. Ridiculous. 10 horsemen broke away from the main group and galloped toward the hill. Reconnaissance or an attack? Gonchan waited. 80 meters, 70, 60. He gave the order. First row. Fire. 20 muskets fired simultaneously. A roar rolled across the desert like thunder. Smoke shrouded the hill. 10 horsemen, 60 meters away. 20 bullets. 7 horsemen fell. 3 horses collapsed. 2 horsemen survived, but their horses reared up and threw their riders. The remaining 50 bandits froze. They didn't understand what had happened. Thunder, smoke, and 7 of their comrades lying on the ground. Gonchan didn't give them time to think. The second row stepped forward. The first was already reloading. The bandits turned and galloped toward the caravan, not out of fear, out of habit. The cavalry is attacking. That was the only thing they knew how to do. 40 horsemen charged the caravan, past the musketeers. A mistake. Flanking fire. Gonchan gave the order. Second row. Fire. 20 muskets. Range 80 meters. Flanking angle. 12 horsemen fell. Horses fell and rolled across the ground. Riders flew from their saddles. Dust. Screams. Chaos. The first row reloaded. Fired. Ganshan counted the seconds. 28, 29, 30. Fire! Third volley. The remaining bandits, a little over 20 of them, turned and ran, at full gallop, into the desert, without looking back. 3 volleys, about 2 minutes, 30 bandits on the ground, about 20 of them killed, the rest wounded. Not a single musketeer was hurt, not a single one. Ganshan came down the hill. His legs were buckling, not from fatigue, from what he had just done. 20 men dead, from the weapon he had created. He knew it was necessary. The caravan would have been destroyed, the guards slaughtered, Deagil killed or captured, the goods looted. But 20 men were dead. From the bullets he had devised, from the gunpowder he had mixed, from the muskets he had designed. He approached the caravan. Deagil stood by the wagon, pale. He looked at the hill where the bodies lay, then at Ganshan, then at the musketeers marching down in formation. He asked what that was. Ganshan replied that it was the future. Deagil said nothing. The caravan guards looked at the musketeers with an expression that Ganshan had once seen in a painting at a museum. That is how people look who have seen the end of the world, or the beginning of a new world. News of the battle at the caravan spread instantly. The merchants told the story. The guards told the story. The surviving bandits told the story. Rumors grew with details. 40 peasants with thundersticks had wiped out 60 mounted warriors in a minute. No, in 30 seconds. No, with a single clap of thunder. The rumors reached Vosan in 3 days, to Chenghe in a week, to the capital in 2, to Modiong in a month. The continent fell silent. Not out of fear, out of incomprehension. No one knew what this was. Thundersticks, weapons without magic, peasants defeating cavalry. It didn't fit into any existing worldview. Quan Sonu came to see Ganshan that same evening. He sat down across from him, silently. He stared for a long time. Then he said that now he knew what those vibrations in the hills had been. Ganshan replied that yes, he knew now. Quan Sonu asked what kind of power it was. Not magic, not mana. What? Ganshan answered with a single word. Science. Quan Sonu stood up. He said he would write to the Supreme Sage personally, not a routine report, a personal letter. Ganshan nodded. He knew this would happen. Now the whole world knew about muskets, or would soon find out. The cards were on the table. There was less time to prepare, much less. The winter of the second year was not like the first. During the first winter, Hasogun had merely survived. This winter, Hasogun was building. Supplies were more than ample. The granaries were full. Firewood had been stockpiled. Coal had been delivered. Meat had been smoked. Fish had been salted. The city was ready for the cold, and the cold held no fear for it. Brick houses with stoves and tiled roofs kept the heat in. The sewer system worked. The water pipes didn't freeze because they were buried below the frost line. Ganshan had learned this the hard way during the first winter, when the wooden gutters burst from the cold. Now the pipes were buried in the ground, stable. Ganshan didn't rest. He launched 2 projects that were to determine Hasogun's future for years to come. The first project, a steam engine. No, not a real steam engine. Not yet. First, a prototype, a concept, a proof of principle. In Park Joon-ho's mind lived the schematic of the simplest steam engine. Boiler, cylinder, piston, connecting rod, flywheel. Steam from the boiler presses on the piston. The piston moves. The connecting rod transfers the motion to the shaft. The shaft turns. That's it. Simple in theory, nightmarishly difficult in practice. He needed a sealed cylinder, made of steel, with a precisely machined inner surface. In a world where the best blacksmiths worked by eye, Millimeter-level precision was the stuff of fantasy. Thalsu listened to the explanation and grew gloomy. He understood the principle. He'd seen how steam lifts the lid of a boiling boiler. But to make a cylinder with a piston that fits tightly and doesn't let steam escape, that's a whole other level. Gonchan didn't push the issue. He told Thalsu that this was not a task for a month or even 6 months. It was a task for a year, maybe 2. The first step was to learn how to turn steel. A lathe was needed, the simplest kind. Gonchan sketched out the lathe: a wooden frame, a steel shaft, a foot pedal drive, a hardened steel cutter. The workpiece spins. The cutter removes shavings. A cylindrical surface is formed, smooth, precise. Thalsu built the lathe in 3 weeks. The first parts were rough: shaft runout, uneven rotation, the cutter wobbled. But with each part, it got better. A month later, Thalsu was turning steel cylinders with a 0.5 millimeter clearance. A steam engine needs a 1/4 millimeter, but the progress was obvious. Second project, defense. After the battle at the Gonchan caravan, he realized that muskets were good, but not enough. 40 musketeers stopped 60 bandits. Against Muran's 20,000 cavalry, something else is needed. More muskets, more gunpowder, and something else: fortifications. Field fortifications that will turn the cavalry's advantage into its curse. Cavalry is strong in open terrain: speed, mass, impact. Infantry cannot withstand a head-on cavalry charge. But if the infantry stands behind fortifications, the cavalry loses speed, it loses its impact. It turns into large, slow targets. Gonchan studied the map. The only route from Muron to Hasagun ran through the Dry Pass, a narrow gorge between 2 rocky ridges, 300 meters wide at its narrowest point, about 2 li long, an ideal place for defense. He rode to the pass himself, spent 2 days there, measured, sketched, calculated, returned with a plan. Earthen redoubts at the exit of the gorge, in a semicircle, 3 lines. The first line is a ditch 2 meters deep and 3 meters wide, with stakes at the bottom. A horse won't be able to jump over it. It'll fall in. The second line is an earthen rampart 1.5 meters high. Behind it, riflemen, musketeers. The third line is a reserve position with grenades and reinforcements. Between the lines are passages for retreat, zigzagging. Cavalry won't get through. Infantry will. He showed the plan to So-hyun. She looked at it and asked how many men the defense was designed for. Gonchan replied that it was for 3,000. She asked how many muskets he had. He replied that he had 60 so far. By spring, there would be 100. So-hyun did the math in her head. She asked what the remaining 2,900 would be armed with. Gonchan replied that they would have spears and shields. They have steel. A spear with a steel tip is no match for a musket, but behind a moat and a rampart, a spearman stands firm. So-hyun nodded. Then she asked when he thought the attack would take place. Gonchan paused. He didn't know for sure, but given the sequence of events, Murion had learned about the muskets. General Young Tae-woo had received the information. He would be preparing, gathering troops, making plans. Cavalry doesn't travel through the desert in winter, so it must be spring, late spring or early summer, when the grass in the desert would provide food for the horses. He said they had 5 or 6 months. So-hyun wrote it down. Meanwhile, Nari had grown quiet. She no longer drew in her notebook. She didn't ask questions about the smithy. She taught classes, she walked around town, she played with the children, and she was silent. Gonchan noticed. One evening, he found her at the south gate. She was sitting on a rock, looking toward the desert, toward home. He sat down beside her. He didn't ask. He waited. Nari spoke first. She said she had received a letter from her brother. General Yan Tae-woo wrote that their father had made a decision. In the spring, the Murion army would march on Hasogun. 20,000 strong. The official reason? To protect trade routes from a new threat. The real reason? Steel, gunpowder, technology, all of it must belong to Murion. Nari said her brother had ordered her to return by the end of winter. She fell silent. Gonchan asked if she would return. Nari didn't answer for a long time. Then she said she didn't know. That here were the children she taught. That here were the people who brought her food and said thank you. That in the 6 months she'd been here, she'd felt needed. For the first time in her life. In Murung, she was the youngest daughter, unwanted, superfluous, good only for being married off to a neighboring prince. Here, she was a teacher. Here, the children called her by name. Gonchan was silent. He couldn't ask her to stay. She was a princess of an enemy state. Her presence during the war was either hostage-taking or treason. For her, not for him. Nari stood up. She said she would leave in a week, and that she was sorry, for many things. Gonchan nodded. A week later, Nari left, quietly, in the morning, without saying goodbye. Only a note for So-hyun. The note listed the names of all the students, and next to each name was a note indicating which subject was difficult for them, so the new teacher would know. So-hyun read the note, folded it neatly, put it in a desk drawer. Then she walked to the window and stood there for a long time. Gonchan didn't ask. He knew. The city had lost a teacher, but the world had gained an opportunity. One small opportunity. Because somewhere in Murion, the king's daughter knew the truth about Hasogun. She knew it wasn't a threat. She knew it was the future. And perhaps that knowledge would be enough, someday. But not in the spring. In the spring, the cavalry would come. Gonchan returned to his work. He had 4 months left. Thalsu was forging muskets, 6 barrels a week now. An expanded forge with 3 furnaces and 20 assistants. Muhan ground gunpowder. The stockpile grew. With Dal, he began building fortifications at Dry Pass. In winter, in the frozen ground. Slowly, painfully. But every day the moat grew deeper. The rampart was higher. The stakes were sharper. So-hyun kept the mobilization lists. 3,000 men capable of bearing arms. 200 of them would be musketeers by spring, if Thalsu could manage it. The rest were spearmen, peasants, artisans, bakers, carpenters, people who had never held a weapon in their hands. Gonchan began training, every day at dawn. Form up, spear forward, shield up, step, stand. Simple commands, simple movements. You don't need to be a warrior. You need to be a wall. A living wall of shields and spears behind which the musketeers stand. An came to training with one arm, 78 years old. He took his place in formation. Gonchan saw him and approached. He said Han didn't need to. He had earned his place. An looked at him. He said he had lived in this dust for 40 years. 3 lords had come and gone. The 4th had stayed. He built walls. He provided water. He provided food. He provided homes. He provided life. If anyone came to take that away, An would stand in formation, with one hand, with a shield, and he wouldn't budge. Gonchan swallowed. He nodded. An remained in formation. Winter dragged on. Short days, long nights. The clang of hammers from the smithy, the roar of gunfire from behind the hill, the clang of shovels at the pass, the quiet voice of So-hyun reading lists by candlelight. Hasogun was preparing for war, the first real war in its short history. Spring came early. The snow melted in a week. The ground dried out. And along with spring came news. The scouts Gonchan had sent to the Murion border returned with a report. An army was gathering. 20,000 cavalry in camps at the eastern edge of the desert. General Yon Tae-woo's banners. Supply wagons. Herds of spare horses. They will set out in 3 or 4 weeks, when the grass in the desert provides forage. Gonchan listened and was not surprised. He had been waiting for this for 6 months. He had been preparing, calculating, checking, recalculating. Now the time for counting was over. It was time to act. He convened a council for the first time. Before, he had made decisions alone. Now the stakes were too high. Seated in a room in the administrative building were Sohyun, Talsu, Sodal, Hong, Obyung-ho, and Chaemugun. 6 people. The entire command staff of Hasogun. Gonchan spread a map out on the table. He showed the location of the Muryong army, the route through the desert, the only passage through the dry pass. The approach time after departure was 10 to 12 days. Then he reported on the resources. Muskets, 180. Thalsu hadn't quite reached 200 yet. 20 barrels were still being worked on. Gunpowder, 400 pounds. Enough for 6,000 shots. Grenades, 300. Signal rockets, 50. Lead bullets, 8,000. Militia, 3,100 men. Of these, 240 are musketeers. The rest are spearmen and shield bearers. Fortifications at Sukhoi Pass, 3 lines, a moat, a rampart, a fallback position. Poles, catapults made from sharpened logs, 90% ready. So Dahl reported that the eastern flank of the fortifications was not yet complete. The rocky ground would not yield to the shovels. Another week was needed. Gonchan said there was a week, maybe 2, but no more. Oh Byung-ho reported on medical readiness. A field hospital behind the 3rd line. Bandages, alcohol, surgical instruments. 10 assistants trained in bandaging. Boiled water in barrels. Stretchers. He said he was ready for 200 wounded. If there are more, he won't be able to handle it. Gonchan nodded. There won't be more than 200, if everything goes according to plan. If. So-hyun reported on the city's supplies. 4 months' worth of grain. Water is stable. Production has been halted. All resources have been diverted to military needs. The evacuation of the non-combatants has been prepared. Women, children, the elderly, the sick. They would head north toward Volsun, along the road Gonchan had been building for 2 years. The road that had once been merely a convenience had now become a path to salvation. Gonchan scanned the room. 6 faces. Tired, tense, but not frightened. That struck him. 2 years ago, these people had been a drunkard blacksmith, an illiterate girl, a one-armed wreck, an unemployed bricklayer, a half-blind doctor, a nameless vagrant. Now they were his general staff, and not a single one of them was going to run away. He said the plan was simple. Not brilliant, not cunning, simple. Muron's army would march through the desert, exhausted by heat and thirst. It would enter Dry Pass, a narrow gorge. The cavalry would stretch out in a column. At the gorge's exit, fortifications would meet them. A moat they couldn't jump over. A rampart behind which musketmen stood. The flanks were blocked by cliffs. It was impossible to outflank them. The cavalry would lose its main advantage, speed and the force of the charge. They will turn into a crowd of horsemen in front of the moat under musket fire. 3,000 against 20,000. Madness by any standard of this world. But this world had no muskets. Gonchan finished and looked at everyone. He asked if there were any questions. Thalsu was the one who asked. What if they break through the moat? Gonchan replied that beyond the moat was a rampart. Behind the rampart were musketeers. Behind the musketeers were spearmen. Behind the spearmen was a 3rd line with grenades. 4 layers. If they get past all 4, Hasogun will lose. But they won't get past them. Thalsu nodded. He believed. Not in the plan, in the man who, 2 years ago, had shown him a blueprint of a furnace and changed his life. The next 3 weeks were the most intense in Hasogun's history. Gonchan lived at Dry Pass. He slept 4 hours a night. He checked every meter of the fortifications, every slingshot, every stake in the moat, every musketeer's position. With Dahl, he finished the eastern flank, blasted the rock with gunpowder. The first use of gunpowder in mountain warfare on this continent. It went down in history as a footnote. But it worked. They filled the moat with rock fragments, tamped it down, set up stakes. The eastern flank is secured. The musketeers trained until it became second nature. Load, fire, reload, form up, 20 seconds between volleys. They cut it down to 20, better than 30. Every second is a matter of life and death. The pikemen stood behind the rampart and learned one thing. Stand. Do not run. Don't flinch. When the cavalry charges at you, every cell in your body screams to run. A pikeman must stand. Shield up. Pike forward. Stand. Gonzes couldn't teach them bravery, but he could teach them discipline. Form. March. Stand. Formation. Step. Stand. 100 times a day, until their legs remember, until their bodies stop thinking and start doing. He made Han the commander of the spearmen. The one-armed old man couldn't hold a spear, but he could stand at the front of the formation and not move. And the men, looking at him, didn't move either. If a 78-year-old, one-armed old man is standing still, how can you run? The evacuation began 10 days before the army's expected arrival. 4,000 people, women, children, the elderly, the sick. The column of wagons stretched along the road to Volson. So-hyun was in charge. Lists, counting, allocation. Every wagon was numbered. Every family was recorded. No one was forgotten. When the last wagon drove out of the gate, So-hyun turned and walked back into town. Gonchan met her at the gate. He asked why she hadn't left. So-hyun looked at him as if he were an idiot. She said the accounting wouldn't run itself. Who would tally the losses? Gonchan wanted to object. He didn't. She wouldn't have left anyway. A scout rode in at dawn on the 16th day. Modeong's army had emerged from the desert. 20,000 cavalry. Young Tae-woo's banners. The vanguard was 2 days' march from the pass. Gonchan stood atop a cliff overlooking the entrance to the gorge. He looked south. The desert was flat and brown as far as the eye could see. Somewhere out there, 20,000 horsemen were marching toward him, toward his city, toward his people, toward what he had built from mud and knowledge over 2 years. He clenched his fists. Park Joon-ho built bridges, but Gonchan would defend what he had built, at any cost. They arrived at dawn. Gonchan stood at the lookout post on the cliff above the gorge and saw them first. Dust. A huge cloud of dust on the horizon. Then figures emerged from the dust. Horsemen. Thousands of horsemen. The column stretched for several li. The banners of Modeong, black with a red sun. At the front rode a horseman on a black horse. Even from a distance, it was clear that he was the commander. Straight back, heavy armor, a helmet with a red plume. General Yun Tae-woo. The messenger rode down to the fortifications. He passed along the front line. The musketeers stood behind the rampart. 240 men in 4 rows. The first row, 60 men, lying on the rampart, muskets at the ready. The fuses smoldered. The second row behind them was on one knee, loaded, ready. The third and fourth rows stood, loading, waiting for their turn. A barrage, continuous fire. Behind the musketeers stood the pikemen, 2,700 men, peasants, artisans, fishermen, carpenters, men who, a month ago, were building houses and plowing the land. Now they stood with spears and shields. The shields were made of planks reinforced with steel strips, heavy but sturdy. Spears with steel tips, 2 meters long. Simple, effective. Han stood at the front of the formation, one arm. His shield was strapped to his stump with straps, a knife at his belt. His back straight, his face calm. Gonchan walked past him. Han nodded. He said nothing. There was no need to say anything. Behind the third line stood Muhan with the grenadiers. 60 men, each with 5 grenades. 300 clay pots filled with gunpowder and stones. The last reserve. On the right flank, a position for signal rockets. If the fortifications fell, a rocket would warn the city. Evacuation of the remaining residents. Retreat. But Gonchan had no plans to retreat. Muran's army entered the gorge around noon. The advance guard, 500 horsemen, light cavalry, reconnaissance. They passed through the gorge and emerged onto the plain before the fortifications. They stopped. They saw the moat, the rampart, the catapults. Men behind the rampart. Gonchan ordered them not to fire. Let the scouts report. Let the general see the fortifications and make a decision. The scouts turned around and galloped back into the gorge. An hour of waiting. 2. The sun rose to its zenith. It was hot. The men behind the rampart were sweating under the steel helmets that Thal Su had been forging for the past 2 weeks. Simple, heavy, but they would stop an arrow. Then an army emerged from the gorge. The whole army. 20,000 cavalrymen were deploying on the plain before the pass. The sight was terrifying. A sea of horsemen from one end to the other. Armor glinted in the sun. Horses snorted. Hooves clattered on the stone. The earth trembled. Gonchan stood on the rampart and watched. His heart beat steadily. Park Jun-ho was afraid. Park Jun-ho was an engineer, not a soldier. But No Gonchan stood firm. Because behind him were 3,000 men who believed in him. And the city he had built. And the children learning to read. And the well with clean water. And the furnace that smelted steel. And the bridge across the river. And the fields of wheat. All of this stood behind him, and he could not retreat. General Yun Tae-woo rode forward. He stopped 300 meters from the moat. He surveyed the fortifications. For a long time, carefully. He was an experienced commander. He saw the moat and understood that his cavalry could not cross it. He saw the catapults and understood that they would slow down the infantry. He saw the people on the rampart, but he did not know what a musket was. He did not know what awaited his cavalry. He saw 3,000 peasants behind the earthen rampart against his 20,000 professional warriors. The math was simple. He sent a messenger. A horseman with a white flag rode up to the moat. He shouted that General Yun Tae-woo demanded the surrender of Hasogun. The Lord's life and freedom were guaranteed. The residents would not be harmed. Resistance was futile. Gonchan stepped to the edge of the rampart. He shouted back. He said that Hasogun would not surrender. He suggested that the general turn around and leave, without losses, with dignity. A trade agreement between Hasogun and Murung was possible. No one needed war. The messenger rode back. A minute. 2. 5. Then the trumpets. The drawn-out roar of Murion's war horns. The first wave moved forward. 5,000 cavalry. The vanguard, the best riders, heavy armor, long spears. They advanced in formation, tight, fast. The ground shook. Gonchan estimated the distance. 300 meters, 250, 200, too far. Muskets aren't accurate at 200. He waited. The cavalry picked up speed, broke into a gallop. 150 meters, 120, 100. The first row of musketeers lay on the rampart, barrels aimed at the mass of horsemen. It was impossible to miss a formation of cavalry at 100 meters, a target 300 meters wide and 50 meters deep. Gonchan raised his hand. He waited. 80 meters. He saw the riders' faces. Young, hardened, confident. They didn't know they were riding to their deaths. His hand dropped. The first volley. 60 muskets fired simultaneously. The sound was like a thunderclap inside his skull, a continuous, deafening roar. A wall of smoke rose before the rampart. Through the smoke, he saw the result. The front row of cavalry collapsed, as if mowed down. Horses fell at full gallop. The riders flew over the horses' heads. Those riding behind crashed into the fallen, a heap of bodies, living and dead. Horses and men. The second row of musketeers stepped forward. The first row rolled back, reloading. 15 seconds passed. The cavalry behind the wall of fallen bodies tried to get around, to ride around, jump over. Horses stumbled over the bodies. A second volley, 60 barrels. A roar, smoke. Dozens more riders on the ground. The third row forward, the second back. Reload. 20 seconds. A third volley. The cavalry stopped, not because the commanders ordered it, because the horses refused to go forward. Before them, a wall of dead bodies. A roar that deafened the ears, smoke that stung the eyes, the smell of gunpowder and blood. A fourth volley, a fifth, a sixth. Every 20 seconds, 60 bullets slammed into the mass of cavalry. Arithmetic, 60 bullets per volley. A 70% hit rate at this range. 42 hits every 20 seconds. 3 volleys per minute. 126 targets hit per minute. The cavalry began to retreat. First, the rear ranks, then the middle ranks, then all of them. They turned and galloped back, to their positions, past the general who stood on the hill and watched. The first wave receded. Bodies remained on the field before the moat. Men, horses. Gonchov counted, no fewer than 400 killed and wounded in 5 minutes. The musketeers had not lost a single man, not a single one. Silence hung over the field, only the moans of the wounded and the snorting of frightened horses. General Young Tae-woo stood on the hill. Gonchan saw his silhouette against the sky, motionless. His aide-de-camp beside him. The general looked out at the field, at the bodies, at the fortifications from which smoke was rising, at the peasants reloading their weapons behind the earthen rampart. He turned to his aide-de-camp, gave the order. Second wave, 10,000 cavalry. All that remained except the reserve. 10,000. Gonchan saw them forming up and his stomach clenched. 400 killed made no impression. The general saw it differently. He had 20,000. Losing 1,000 to take the fortifications was an acceptable trade-off. He didn't understand. Not yet. 10,000 cavalrymen moved forward. Not at a gallop, at a walk. Slowly, in a broad front. Clever. A dispersed target is harder to hit with volley fire. Gonchan appreciated that. The general learns quickly, but not quickly enough. The cavalry advanced at a walk for 200 meters. Then they broke into a trot. Then a gallop. The ground rumbled. 10,000 horses. Gonchan waited until they were 100 meters away. A volley. Reload. A volley. Reload. A volley. The cavalry was spread out, and the losses from each volley were fewer, but the volleys did not stop. Every 20 seconds, in rows, continuously. The front riders fell, but those behind pressed forward. The mass pushed forward. The first riders reached the ditch. The horses saw the pit and stopped. Some jumped. They crashed onto the stakes. The scream of a horse impaled on a sharpened log is a sound Gonchan will hear for the rest of his life. The moat filled with bodies. The riders dismounted. They tried to cross on foot. Over the bodies of their comrades and horses, the musketeers fired point blank. 20 meters. Missing was impossible. Grenades flew over the rampart. Mugen gave the order. 60 clay pots filled with gunpowder and stones exploded among the foot soldiers in front of the moat. Explosions, screams, stones whizzing like shrapnel. The horses went mad from the roar. They threw riders from their mounts, trampled the foot soldiers, crushed their own men. Some warriors broke through the moat, dozens of them. They ran up to the rampart, began to climb. The spearmen met them. On stood at the front of the formation, with one arm, with a shield tied to his stump. He didn't move. He stood like a rock. The spearmen beside him stood still as well. A wall of shields, a forest of spears. The Muron warriors climbed the rampart and fell, pierced by steel. The battle lasted another 20 minutes. The musketeers fired. The spearmen held their ground. The grenadiers threw. Then the Murion trumpets sounded again. Retreat. 10,000 cavalrymen rolled back, slowly, heavily, leaving the dead and wounded on the field. The moat was filled with bodies. The ground in front of the fortifications was soaked with blood. Gunpowder smoke hung over the field like fog. Gonchan stood on the rampart. His legs buckled, his hands shook, but he stood. He counted the casualties, his own. 43 wounded, 8 killed. 8. 8 men he knew by name, who had come to Hasogun 2 years ago, hungry and ragged, whom he had fed, to whom he had given homes, work, the future. Now they lay dead on the rampart they had defended. Muron's losses. He couldn't count them exactly, but thousands lay on the field before the moat and in the moat. Not hundreds, thousands. 3 volleys from the first wave, 20 minutes from the second. 7 minutes of sustained fire in total. 4,000 Murion warriors on the ground, killed and wounded. General Young Tae-woo stood on the hill and looked out over the field. His aide stood beside him. The general turned to him. He spoke, quietly. The aide later recounted those words, and they went down in history. The general said that the world had just changed, and they hadn't even heard when. Then he gave the order. Retreat. Complete. The Muryong army withdrew from their positions and retreated back into the gorge. 20,000 had come. 16,000 were leaving. 4,000 remain on the field at Dry Pass. Gonchan watched them leave. Then he sat down on the rampart, right on the ground, and closed his eyes. His men stood around him, peasants with muskets, spearmen with blood-stained shields. The wounded were being carried off to Obyung-ho. The living who couldn't believe they were alive. So-hyun approached. She sat down beside him, silently. A minute later, Tao-su approached. He stood, a hammer on his shoulder, his face black with gunpowder soot. So-dal approached. Hong, Mugan, everyone had come. Everyone stood around, in silence. The first battle involving firearms in the history of this world. The first and last in which one side had muskets and the other did not. The world had truly changed, and no one heard when. After the battle, the world fell silent for 3 months. Not a single kingdom sent an envoy. Not a single army marched to the borders. Not a single merchant arrived at the trading post. Silence. Gonchan knew this was the silence before the decision. The continent was digesting the news. 3,000 peasants had destroyed the vanguard of a 20,000-strong army and forced the best general, Mudon, to retreat. Without magic, without swordsmen, without cavalry, with thunder rods and an earthen rampart. Every king, every duke, every general on the continent was asking himself one question. What does this mean for me? Gonchan didn't wait for them to answer. He got to work. The city needed to be rebuilt. Not from destruction. There was no destruction. From mobilization. 3,000 men had spent 3 months preparing for war instead of building and sowing. The spring sowing was a month late. Steel production had halted during mobilization. Construction ground to a halt. Trade ceased. Gonchan got everything back up and running in 2 weeks. The musketeers returned to the fields and workshops. The muskets were put away in the arsenal. The gunpowder was locked up. Spears and shields were in storage. The city was building again, sewing, forging, trading. But something had changed. People walked differently. They looked differently. They had won. The peasants had defeated the army. It was impossible by every law of this world. And they had done it. 8 graves by the southern wall served as a reminder of the price. Gonchan came to them every morning. He stood there, in silence. The names were carved into the stone. 8 names. 8 men who had come to Kashagan hungry and died defending their home. He memorized every name, and he promised himself that no one else would die behind a wall that could have been built stronger. Thalsu returned to the lathe, a cylinder for a steam engine. During the mobilization, he thought. At night when he couldn't sleep. And he found a solution to the precision problem, double boring. First a rough cutter, then a fine one. 2 passes. The gap was reduced to 1/4 of a millimeter, enough for steam. The first prototype of the steam engine started working in the middle of summer. Small, ugly, rumbling. A sheet steel boiler. A cylinder 10 centimeters in diameter. A piston moving back and forth with a wheeze and a whistle. A connecting rod turning a flywheel. The flywheel turned, slowly, jerky, with steam leaking from under the piston, but it turned. Gonchan stood and watched. Thalsu stood nearby. Both were silent. The flywheel turned. It was ugly, inefficient, primitive. And it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Gonchan connected the flywheel to the mill via a belt drive, a steam mill, the first in the history of the world. It ground grain 3 times faster than a water mill, and it didn't depend on the river. It ran on coal and water, anywhere, anytime. Then he connected the forge bellows to the steam engine. Thalsu no longer needed people pumping air. The machine pumped, continuously, evenly, more powerfully than 10 men. The temperature in the furnace rose. The quality of the steel improved. Then came the water pump. Water now flowed not by gravity, but under pressure. Higher, further, more. Every application of the steam engine opened up 3 new ones. The technological cascade accelerated. The silence ended in the fall. The first to arrive was an ambassador from Muran, not a general, a diplomat, with a white flag and a trade proposal. King Yang Taesong asked for peace, not out of fear, out of calculation. 4,000 dead is too high a price for a city that can be obtained through trade. The ambassador proposed a trade agreement, steel in exchange for horses, glass in exchange for silk, and peace, complete, indefinite. Gonchan accepted. The terms were harsh but fair. Both sides received what they lacked. Muran received steel and tools. Hasogun received horses and textiles. War is unnecessary. Trade is more profitable. This was exactly what Gonchan had wanted from day one, to become so indispensable that war would be more costly than trade. The second to arrive was an envoy from the Tower of Sages, not a magician observer, the supreme sage himself. Cho Huisun, 60 years old, a gray beard, calm eyes. He arrived without an entourage, alone, on a donkey. Gonchan received him personally. Huisun sat down. He looked out the window, a glass one, out onto the street, the cobblestone street, at the people, the well-fed ones, at the steam mill puffing away behind the building. He said he had not come to fight. He had come to understand. Gonchan waited. Huisun spoke slowly. He said that the Tower of Sages had stood for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, mages had been necessary. Without them, there was no water, no fire, no healing, no protection. The tower provided all of this, for a fee. And the world was organized around this. Now a young man from the desert had built a well without a water mage. He smelted steel without a fire mage. He healed illnesses without a healing mage. And he defeated an army without battle mages. The 1,000-year-old order was crumbling. Huisin asked what Gonshin proposed instead. Gonshin was silent. He thought. Then he answered. He said he didn't want to destroy the tower. Magic is real. It exists. It can do what technology cannot. Not yet, anyway. He proposed a partnership. The tower would study his technology. He would study magic. Not to cast spells, to understand. If magic is a form of energy, then it obeys laws. And those laws can be studied, systematized, utilized. A fire mage is stronger than a single musketeer. That is true. But if magic can be understood and amplified by technology, then a mage with technological support will be stronger than both of them. Huisin listened. His expression didn't change. When Gonshan finished, Huisin was silent for a long time. Then he said that in 1,000 years of the tower, no one had ever suggested that mages learn from a non-mage. It was an insult to tradition. But a tradition that never changes isn't a tradition. It's a corpse. He stood up. He extended his hand. Gonshan shook it. The supreme sage and an engineer from another world. A handshake that would determine the continent's next 100 years. Huisin left. He promised to send a delegation of mage researchers. Not observers, researchers. People who want to understand, not control. The third event of the fall was a letter from his father. Not a decree, not a demand, a letter. Duke No Tehewan wrote briefly. He had learned of the battle, learned of the trade agreement with Muriang, learned that the debt had been repaid, learned that the emperor was interested. He wrote that he had been wrong, that his fourth son had not turned out to be an empty vessel, that the No clan was proud, that the demands for technology transfer were being withdrawn, and that his older brother, Gonmin, had received a direct order from their father, not to interfere. Gonchan read the letter and felt a void. 2 years ago, these words would have meant everything. His father's approval, recognition, acceptance. Now they meant little. He was building Hasogun not for his father, not for the clan, for the people who lived and worked here and died on the ramparts defending their home. He put the letter away in his desk. He didn't throw it away, but he didn't hang it on the wall either. Winter passed in work. The steam engine was improving. The second prototype, the third, each more powerful and reliable than the last. Thalsu and his 3 best apprentices worked without rest. A steam-powered lathe, a drilling machine, a rolling mill. Each machine created tools to build the next machine. Machines gave birth to machines. By the spring of the 3rd year, Gonshan had built the first section of the railroad. Steel rails on wooden ties, a steam-powered rail car, a speed of 20 miles an hour. The track ran from Hasogun to the quarry, 3 miles. Stone that had previously been hauled by oxen for a day now traveled along the rails in 20 minutes. When the rail car passed by for the first time, people stood along the tracks and were silent. Some were crying, not out of fear, because they couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. An iron carriage without a horse that moves on its own and pulls 10 tons of stone behind it. It was beyond imagination. News of the railroad swept across the continent faster than any horse. The Shogun's Herald published a special edition featuring a drawing of the railcar. Within a month, that drawing could be seen in every courtyard. Envoys began arriving one after another. Miran was already there. Then came envoys from the kingdom of Tanso in the north, from the trading republic of Harem in the east, from the mountain principality of Norin, from the island clan of Chisu. 6 states had sent envoys within 2 months. Each wanted the same thing: to trade, to buy steel, to buy glass, to buy paper, to buy bricks and cement, and to learn how the iron wagon worked. Gonshan received each one. He concluded trade agreements, on the same terms. Standard prices, standard quality, guarantees, a free market. Every contract tied another state to the Hasogun economy. Every shipment of steel, every bag of cement, every sheet of paper made war with the Hasogun slightly less profitable and trade slightly more profitable. A web of economic ties was woven, thread by thread. By this point, the population had reached 80,000. The city had expanded beyond the walls. New neighborhoods were growing to the north and east. Gonchan was planning a second wall, an outer one, longer than the first. But for now, they made do with what they had. Falsu was no longer managing a smithy, but a metallurgical plant. 3 blast furnaces, 50 workers, 20 machines, 100 tons of steel a month, a volume comparable to the rest of the empire combined. Together with Dahl, he was building a railroad to Volson, a full-scale one. Rails, sleepers, embankments, bridges over ravines. A 2-year project. But once it was finished, the journey from Hasogun to Volson would be cut from 2 days to 4 hours. So-hyun ran the administration of a city that had grown from a village into a capital. 40 officials under her command. The budget, taxes, the court, the police, schools, hospitals. She worked 18 hours a day and managed to do it all, and keep a journal. The list of burned books had reached 347 titles. She had long since stopped pretending to believe, but she didn't ask. Maybe someday. Oh Byung-ho opened a medical school, 20 students, the first course on the continent where doctors were taught anatomy and hygiene rather than incantations. He wrote a textbook, the first medical textbook printed at the Hasogun printing house, 500 copies, sold out in a month. Hong sat by the south gate, every day, on the same rock. He watched the road. He told the children the story of the city, how the Lord arrived with a single skinny horse and a handful of clay in his fist, how he said one word, enough. The children listened. They remembered. They will tell their children. Emperor Hwan Do-hyun came in person, not with an army, with a trade proposal, and with a small entourage, 20 people, advisors, scribes, guards. He rode along the road that Gonchan had built, across the bridge that Gonchan had built, past the fields that Gonchan had sown, past the workshops that Gonchan had created, and with each one, his face changed. When he saw the city wall, the glass lanterns in the streets, the paved squares, the steam mill, the printing press, a school, a hospital, a railroad stretching beyond the horizon, he stopped at the gate. He stood up. He looked. 3 years ago, it had been nothing but dust. Gonchan met him at the gate, alone, without guards, without an entourage, in simple clothes, his hands calloused, his face tanned. A 19-year-old boy who had built the future in 3 years. Or a 22-year-old. Time had passed quickly. The emperor looked at him, then at the city behind him, then at him again. Then he turned to his entourage. His voice was heard by all. He said to revoke the title. He is not the lord of the county. He is the lord of what will come after them. Silence. Then applause. Not from the entourage, from the people on the city wall, from the peasants in the square, from the children running down the street, from Thalsu standing by the smithy with a hammer on his shoulder, from So-dal on the scaffolding, from So-hyun in the doorway of the administrative building with a journal in his hands. Gonchan stood before the emperor and didn't know what to say. Park Jun-ho built bridges across bays, but Gonchan built a bridge across time. From the Middle Ages to the future, from hunger to plenty, from darkness to light, from dust to history. That evening, he climbed onto the roof of the administrative building. He stood at the edge. He looked at the city, lights in the windows, smoke from the chimneys, the sound of hammers and children's laughter, and the roar of a steam engine, and the murmur of water in the canals, and the distant whistle of a mine car on the rails. 80,000 people, 3,200 3 years ago, and one dry well. He looked at the stars. The Milky Way blazed from horizon to horizon, just like on the first night, just like always. He thought of Seoul, of the bridge across Asan Bay, of the formwork collapsing, of the darkness, of how he woke up in a stranger's body with a stranger's name in a stranger's world, and he built a life out of it, not his own, a shared one. He thought about how he knows where this path leads: the Industrial Revolution, factories, pollution, exploitation, weapons growing ever more terrifying, wars growing ever larger in scale. He knows the endpoint: the atomic bomb, climate change, plastic in the ocean. He knows all the mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, knowing them in advance, he'll be able to build something different. Not perfect. Perfection is impossible. But different. Better. With textbooks instead of bombs. With hospitals instead of prisons. With roads instead of borders. Maybe. A door opened downstairs. Footsteps on the stairs. So-hyun stepped out onto the roof, a magazine in her hands, as always. She stood beside him, silently. Then she said that the list of burned books had reached 347 titles, and that no library in the world contained so much diverse knowledge, and that she no longer believed in the burned books, and that she didn't care. Because every time she believed him, a wall was built and people were fed. So she kept believing. Gon-chan looked at her. At this girl who was 17 when he arrived, who was the only literate person in a village of 3,000 people, who now ran a city of 80,000, who had never let him down. Not once had she run away. Not once had she asked what he couldn't tell her. He said that someday he would tell her the truth, the whole truth. She nodded. She said she wasn't in a hurry. They had time. They stood on the roof and looked at the city, at the stars, at the world that was changing. Slowly, irreversibly. For the better, maybe.